Imagine a quiet, close-knit community where everyone seems to know each other, and crime is a rare occurrence. Sara Starr, a teacher, a caring mother, and a dedicated member of her local church, was always smiling, always attentive to those around her. But one morning, she simply vanished, and just a few hours later, she was found lifeless in her own driveway. 2 shots from a shotgun ended her life in an instant. But here's the strange part. The main suspect was her ex-husband, Jason. Witnesses claimed he had threatened her, but he insisted on his innocence, even presenting a rock-solid alibi. So what's really going on here? Could someone else have been involved in this tragic twist of fate? Why did the authorities continue to suspect him despite the lack of direct evidence? Today, we'll dive into a complex investigation that spanned several years. You'll discover the secrets hidden behind the facade of this seemingly perfect town, and learn just how far desperation and a thirst for revenge can push someone. Are you ready to uncover the truth about what really happened to Sara Starr? It all started on November 27, 2017. On a sunny morning around 9 a.m., the emergency services of Coffee County, Alabama, received a distressing call. The man on the line spoke calmly, but his words left no doubt. He reported that his acquaintance, Sara Starr, had likely taken her own life. Officers immediately rushed to the scene, a small house owned by the local church. This house, originally built to house the pastor, had been rented out for years only to church members. Sara Starr, a woman with a complicated past, had been living there under special terms provided by the church. The home had become her refuge after enduring a 2-year-long divorce process, leaving her alone with her 4 children. She was 38 years old, trying to start fresh, far from the painful memories and conflicts of her past. Sara was born in the small town of Colby, Kansas, in 1979. People always saw her as talented and caring, especially when it came to children. She chose to become a teacher, graduating from college and starting her career at a local school. Teaching literature and writing, she easily connected with her students, and many described her as a positive and attentive educator. Her marriage to Jason began back in 2001. At that time, she was 22 and had just earned her bachelor's degree in education. Jason was 6 years older and had recently returned from the military. Their relationship seemed harmonious. Both dreamed of building a family and appeared to be happy, but as is often the case, trouble was brewing behind the scenes. At first, their marriage seemed peaceful. The couple settled in Colby, where they welcomed a set of twins, followed by another set 5 years later. However, Jason struggled with the responsibilities of fatherhood. He became increasingly irritable, snapping at Sara over the noise of the kids, the constant mess, and lack of sleep. With each passing year, his frustrations grew more pronounced, and he didn't hesitate to belittle her, even in front of others. Sara tried to keep the peace, finding solace in her faith. She became a devoted member of the local Baptist church, which gradually became her second home. With her gentle nature and outgoing personality, she quickly made new friends. Sara took up gardening and photography, immersing herself in hobbies to distract from the turmoil at home. In 2016, when her life seemed to be on steadier ground, Sara started working as a 4th-grade teacher. She continued to be seen as a caring and friendly person, but behind that warm exterior lay hidden struggles. Jason, growing increasingly resentful of his role as a father of 4, became more aggressive, and the tension in their marriage escalated. After numerous attempts to save their relationship, Sara finally decided to file for divorce. She moved out, leaving the house to Jason, and found refuge in a home offered by the church. Relocating to Alabama appeared to be her opportunity for a fresh start. However, the divorce process dragged on and her financial situation worsened. According to Jason, Sara began spending recklessly, which only added to her troubles. The move was supposed to mark the beginning of a new chapter for her, but it didn't go as smoothly as she had hoped. On the day she left Jason's house, Sara invited 2 close friends, Dana and Lawrence, to help her with the move. They recalled how she was frantic, running around, forgetting things, and repeatedly going back and forth. Sara's behavior seemed unstable, and Dana and Lawrence sensed she was afraid of something. Her main concern was that Jason might show up and cause trouble, and her fears weren't unfounded. Now a single mother, Sara felt her life becoming increasingly difficult. Despite the support of her church, the loneliness and financial burdens weighed heavily on her. When Sara and her children finally arrived at the new house provided by the church, Jason did indeed show up. He approached the front door, but Lawrence stood his ground, blocking him from entering. Sensing that confrontation wouldn't work in his favor, Jason eventually left. However, according to Lawrence, Sara's reaction was as if she had seen a ghost. She was shaking and crying. She insisted that Jason had threatened her, and now her worst fears had come true. 2 years after that incident, the divorce process finally concluded. The court ruled that the children would be under shared custody between both parents. Jason was ordered to pay child and spousal support to Sara, which significantly impacted his financial situation. He had to give up more than half of his income. Sara continued living in the church-provided home, while Jason moved to another house nearby, where he stayed with his mother. The morning of November 27, 2017, started like any other, except for one crucial difference. Sara didn't show up for work. Her colleagues, who knew her as an extremely punctual and responsible person, were immediately concerned. Sara wasn't answering calls or reading messages, and her absence seemed completely out of character. One of her colleagues, worried, drove over to Sara's house to check if everything was okay. When her colleague arrived, she found Sara's lifeless body on the driveway. Several gunshot wounds, blood, all pointed to a violent act. Emergency services were called right away, but it was already too late for Sara. The police arrived on the scene and initially considered the possibility of self-harm. But after examining the crime scene, they quickly realized this was an act of aggression. As it was later revealed, the shots were fired around 6:30 a.m. when Sara was leaving her house. An unknown assailant, armed with a shotgun, had been waiting for her and fired at close range. The first shot hit her chest, and the second, her head. Neighbors heard the shots, but they didn't think much of it. In the rural area where hunters were common, such sounds weren't unusual. No one imagined they were hearing Sara's final moments. Forensics experts arrived at the scene but found no fingerprints or tire tracks. The perpetrator had been careful. However, knowing about the recent divorce and the tense relationship between Sara and her ex-husband, the police's suspicions naturally turned toward Jason. The first people detectives spoke with were Sara's friends, Dana and Lawrence. They confirmed that the last few months had been particularly hard for Sara. She often expressed her fear of Jason and even suggested that he might go to extreme lengths to get back at her. Their statements added tension to the investigation. Sara's ex-husband, Jason, lived just a few minutes' walk from her home, giving him enough time to arrive there in the early morning and leave undetected afterward. Detectives, suspicious of Jason, continued to dig into the sequence of events, increasingly focusing on his potential involvement. However, when they brought him in for questioning, Jason insisted on his innocence, claiming that he was having breakfast at a cafe with his kids at the time of the crime. Surveillance footage and witness testimonies backed up his alibi, yet the detectives remained reluctant to rule him out. His motives were clear: a messy divorce, child support, and financial obligations that had become a major strain on his budget. Sara's friends and family repeatedly told police that she was afraid of Jason. They were convinced that if anyone could have gone to such extremes, it was him. However, the police had no direct evidence linking him to the crime. Several press conferences were held, with authorities urging the public to come forward with any information that might help solve the case. The state's governor even announced a $5,000 reward for information leading to the arrest of the perpetrator, and a local resident added another $500 to the sum. Despite the police's efforts and widespread publicity, the investigation stalled. The case went cold for several years, and it wasn't until December 2021 that detectives regained momentum after receiving new information. They became convinced that Jason might have been involved indirectly, possibly by hiring someone to carry out the crime. He had a strong motive. After the divorce, he was required to pay child support that amounted to more than half of his income. which had become a serious financial burden. When detectives began examining Jason's digital records, they found something curious on his computer, notes that he seemed to be writing as if for a book. In these entries, he detailed his thoughts about his relationship with Sara, the perceived injustice of the court's decision, and his resentment toward paying child support. The texts contained derogatory remarks about women, further deepening the police's suspicions. The detectives also reviewed his financial transactions leading up to the crime and uncovered several unusual payments. Between September 7th and November 15th, 2017, Jason transferred $2,600 to a woman named Lily. It turned out she was a friend of Jason's brother Darren. What made this even more suspicious was that no previous transfers had ever taken place between them, and according to Lily, they barely knew each other until then. When detectives questioned Lily, they discovered that Jason had given his brother a 2016 motorcycle, an expensive vehicle, supposedly for repairs after an accident. He claimed the bike needed major work, costing around $5,000, and arranged to send money to his brother through Lily in small amounts. This struck detectives as odd. Why would Jason, who was already struggling financially, suddenly decide to gift his brother such an expensive item? And why was he using Lily, a woman he barely knew, to facilitate these transactions? Detectives suspected that Jason and Darren might have been disguising these payments as repair costs, but they could have actually been payments related to the crime. They began closely monitoring Darren. Darren, a rough and solitary man, had lived most of his life in a trailer in Texas and kept to himself. He'd had past run-ins with the law, once for speeding, during which he was found with illegal substances. The detectives decided to check the brothers' communications, including text messages and phone calls. They seized their phones and uncovered some crucial details. It turned out that before Thanksgiving 2017, Darren had indeed traveled to Coffee County, Alabama. He arrived on November 18th and stayed in the area for 10 days, with his phone frequently pinging near Sara's house. The night before the crime, his phone was switched off around midnight, which raised suspicions. It wasn't turned back on until 10 a.m. the next morning, by which time he was already back in Texas. This suggested that Darren might have deliberately tried to hide his whereabouts during the time of the crime. That same day in the evening, Darren sent Jason a text message that appeared coded. He mentioned a successful deer hunt. Police believe the brothers were using coded language to communicate. One of Sara's neighbors recalled seeing a motorcycle matching Darren's near Sara's home. This distinctive bike had been spotted by other residents in the area before the incident, but no one thought much of it at the time. Another critical piece of evidence emerged when detectives reviewed footage from a surveillance camera on a shed near Sara's home. The camera captured a motorcycle, matching Darren's bike's description, leaving the area just minutes after the gunshots were heard. December 2021 became a turning point in the investigation. Armed with enough evidence, the police charged Jason and his brother Darren, suspecting them of conspiring to commit a crime. Jason was arrested first, and despite his defiant attitude and loud claims of innocence, he quickly requested a lawyer. However, his confidence was short-lived. Shortly after interrogations, he unexpectedly confessed to Sara's death. Despite this confession, he was released on bail with the condition of wearing an electronic monitoring bracelet. When Darren learned of his brother's arrest, he went on the run. The police and FBI launched a manhunt, placing him on the most wanted list. An initial reward of $10,000 was offered for information leading to his capture, which was later increased to $22,000. Nearly 2 months later, on February 5, 2022, Darren turned himself in Texas. He denied any involvement, and unlike Jason, he refused to post bail, choosing instead to remain in jail until the trial. The hearings dragged on for months due to the abundance of circumstantial evidence and the lack of direct proof. Darren's attorney argued that there were no physical traces linking his client to the crime scene. He pointed out that the weapon used in the crime was never found, and that the surveillance footage was too unclear for a positive identification. He also emphasized that the absence of fingerprints and motorcycle tire tracks weakened the prosecution's case. In response, the prosecution presented evidence of the transactions between Jason and Lily, highlighting the financial transfers made in the months before and after the crime. They argued that these payments were for services rendered and that the motorcycle given to Darren was used for the trip to Alabama. A crucial piece of evidence was the surveillance footage from the shed, which showed a motorcycle matching Darren's leaving the scene shortly after the crime. The prosecution insisted that the brothers used Lily to transfer money to conceal their tracks. When questioned in court, Lily stated that she was unaware of the brothers' intentions and was simply following their requests. All charges against her were eventually dropped, but her testimony played a key role in building the case against the brothers. The trial lasted several days, with each side attempting to sway the jury. Jason's lawyer emphasized the restaurant footage showing Jason with his children at the time of the crime as solid proof of his alibi. He also highlighted that Jason had voluntarily handed over his phone and computer to the police, which, he argued, was not typical behavior for someone trying to hide their involvement. Despite the defense's efforts, Jason's own confession, combined with the collected circumstantial evidence, convinced the jury. After 6 days of testimony and 6 hours of deliberation, the jury found both brothers guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. On January 4th, 2024, Jason and Darren were sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This verdict was seen as a form of mercy, as the nature of the crime could have led to the death penalty, but the jury could not reach a unanimous decision on that outcome. Jason has also been ordered to pay a fine of $25,000. Darren's attorney announced plans to appeal the verdict, while Jason's defense team opted not to, given his confession. As for the Starr children, Sara's parents have taken custody. During the trial, the older twins publicly renounced their father, stating they no longer wanted any contact with him. Both brothers remain in federal prison, and there is currently no confirmed information about the status or outcome of any potential appeals. This story is not just about jealousy and family conflicts. It's a reminder of how financial and emotional issues can spiral into tragedy. The most heartbreaking part is that the innocent children, whom Jason was supposed to protect, lost their mother at the hands of their own father and uncle. This case highlights the importance of recognizing signs of aggression and manipulation in relationships, and the painful reality that sometimes those closest to us can be more dangerous than we realize. Stories like this one prompt us to ask, how well do we truly know the people around us? Perhaps you or someone close to you is in a challenging relationship right now. Never ignore warning signs, because unfortunately, a story like Sara's could happen to anyone. Take care of yourself. Don't be afraid to seek help, and pay attention to the well-being of those you love. It's crucial to remember that even those we trust the most can pose a threat, and this case is a stark reminder of that. What are your thoughts on what happened? Can financial pressure and resentment ever justify such a monstrous act? Share your thoughts below and tell us how you would handle a similar situation if you ever found yourself in one. The price of love. What determines our future? Definitely the decisions we make and the actions we take. However, sometimes chance intervenes in the usual way of life, and then they say that you can't escape fate. Also happened to the heroes of today's story, Joseph and Olga Connell, whose life paths crossed in an unexpected way, after which the couple never parted. Unfortunately, the lovers could not enjoy each other to the fullest, as they were destined for a terrible fate. Around 2 a.m. on September 23, 2013, a series of gunshots rang out near the Paladin Club condominium in Wilmington, Delaware. When eyewitnesses ran to the scene, they saw a man and a woman lying on the ground. A little later, a call went out to emergency services. The caller reported the attack and its victims. Medics arrived and administered first aid. Despite the gunshot wounds to the face and loss of blood, the victim was alive, which could not be said about her companion. The bullet-riddled man showed no signs of life. Apparently, he was killed instantly, shot in the back of the head. Unfortunately, time was running against him. Realizing this, police officers questioned the woman about what had happened. In response, she uttered something inaudible and lost consciousness. The victim was rushed to the hospital. However, Halfway there, she gave up her last attempts to fight for life and died. Working at the scene, specialists found personal belongings and documents. Connell's newlyweds turned out to be the deceased. All valuables, wallet, purse, cell phones, and even the diamond ring on Olga's hand were not stolen, which means that the attack was not an attempted robbery, but a targeted murder. It was later determined that the victims were attacked outside their home. After the young men returned home from celebrating their spouse's 39th birthday, the attackers acted in a treacherous manner and fired approximately 25 shots into their backs. Detectives had to figure out what interrupted the couple's love affair and whether the motive for the crime could have been a long-running domestic dispute. Connell family. Joseph was born into a successful and close-knit family. He was the middle child and had an older brother, John, and a younger sister, Kelly. During the younger years, the children often quarreled over nothing, but when their parents divorced, they rallied and became inseparable. After the breakup of relations, the guys stayed to live with their mother. After a while, another man appeared in the life of a woman. The new marriage turned out to be successful in all plans. The family still did not need anything, and the stepfather replaced the father. The family lived in a fairly quiet and cozy neighborhood. During the day, everyone went about their business, and in the evenings, everyone gathered around the round table and discussed personal events. Joe grew up a correct and persistent boy. However, these qualities were more about school and work. Otherwise, he was a fun-loving boy and the soul of the company. Even from an early age, the young man dreamed of starting his own business and to establish himself as a businessman. Thanks to his business acumen and resourcefulness, his efforts bore fruit. Together with his best friend, Christopher Rivers, the hero of the story became the owner of a machine store and a specialized store in Tullyville. Everyone in the neighborhood knew the young men as successful partners who had risen from scratch. The buddies were very friendly, moreover, burned a common idea, and developed their business. The story of acquaintance. Joseph was a convinced bachelor until he met a Russian beauty, Olga. Communication between the young people began on the dating site. They quickly found common topics for conversation as they were already quite mature people with a lot of life experience. A female friend admitted online that she was in the process of divorce and had only recently moved to the United States. The man told about his experienced relationships and plans for the future. Both interlocutors were sociable and bright personalities, had similar interests and views on life. Therefore, it is not surprising that gradually their feelings grew into something more. One day, Joe realized that he no longer imagines his life without his beloved and made her an offer. Olga reciprocated. The only nuance was the fact that the bride has not yet been presented to the family. However, the man did not fear for this. He was confident in his choice and in the reaction of relatives. The beauty and character of the chosen one charmed his relatives. They were in shock that there was a woman who managed to melt the heart of a hot, loving relative. Relationships of the couple developed rapidly. Joe took Olga everywhere with him, proud of her appearance and charisma, therefore without shyness did not hide his love. However, over time it became clear that behind the female malleability and tenderness hides a real Siberian temperament where the beloved was born. Her irrepressible energy and entrepreneurial spirit amazed everyone. She seemed to be able to do anything. Connell was so delighted and in love that he decided not to postpone the wedding in a long time. Perhaps he was in such a hurry to get married, unwittingly anticipating the coming events. Such people are usually said, in a hurry to live. Surely each of you have encountered such examples in your environment. Investigation. After the attack, the police interviewed the crowd, bystanders and neighbors of the victims. Perhaps among them were those who could clarify something. Unfortunately, none of them had seen what had happened. However, many people heard gunshots which caused them to run away. There were even those who claimed to have heard loud male voices shortly before the shooting. They seemed to be arguing with the newlyweds about something. Violent crime ensued. Not far from the scene of the crime, forensic experts found a large number of fired casings that belonged to two different types of weapons. Thus, it became clear that there were several attackers. The sheer number of gunshots indicated that the couple was initially given a death sentence. It is unlikely that anyone would have managed to stay alive in such a shootout. To carry out their plan, the criminals waited for the young people to return from the party. The birthday party took place in one of the popular bars. Friends and some members of the Connell family came to the party. Everyone had fun and danced until midnight, and when they were tired, they went home. The couple parked their car at the house and headed toward the front entrance. It was at this point that the intruders found the most opportune time to carry out their criminal scheme. The next step in the investigation was to interview the family members of the victims. Officers spoke to Joseph's parents. They asked about the couple's alleged enemies and detractors. But the man's mother and stepfather replied that they knew nothing about it. At first glance, the newlyweds had no foes. On the other hand, there is hardly anyone who does not have envious people. In any case, none of the newly wedded spouses told it. At the same time, the detectives heard some curious information. It turns out that Joe and his sister Kelly had a spat on the eve of the wedding. It concerned an expensive family ring encrusted with diamonds. According to experts, its value was about $20,000. After the quarrel, relations between the relatives were not the same. However, all relatives claimed that Kelly would never have gone to the crime. Especially, it turned out that after the attack, the ring remained on Olga's finger. Nevertheless, the version about the hidden offense had to be checked. By a strange coincidence, on the unfortunate night, Kelly was one of the first on the scene of the crime. Despite the fact that the woman lived in another neighborhood, that time she was nearby. The ring story. The lovers planned to get married in the Virgin Islands. The only thing that marred the wedding preparations was the engagement ring. According to family tradition, the mother passed the family jewel to her son. However, the jewelry had already been given to the youngest daughter for the wedding, which took place 10 years ago. In order not to change the established custom, Joe discreetly took the ring from his sister and replaced the precious stones with zirconium. After that, he secretly returned the ring to the mistress and diamonds inserted into the setting of Olga's engagement jewelry. The deed of the protagonist is difficult to explain, especially given his financial situation. Perhaps in this way, he decided not to violate the established rules. It was assumed that none of the women should not have guessed it. However, things had not gone as calculated. Kelly noticed the switch and began looking for the culprit. When the younger sister learned of her brother's action, she was extremely outraged. Understandably, she expressed her indignation to Joseph. However, the latter was very upset, as he thought that the sister was angry for nothing and just wanted to violate family traditions and ruin the wedding. One way or another, but the ceremony took place. Kelly did not attend the event, citing employment. At the same time, in retaliation, the woman decided to mar the celebration and sent a sarcastic message to Olga, so the unsuspecting bride learned the truth. After that, the relationship between brother and sister became strained. Periodically between them there were altercations, often sounded mutual reproaches and insults, and the event that occurred afterward and completely knocked everyone out of the rut, a mysterious robbery. Joint life at the newlyweds began there in the Virgin Islands. During the honeymoon, the couple enjoyed marriage. Olga and Joseph sunbathed on the beach, swam in the sea, fished, rode on a yacht, and tried exotic cuisine. There was plenty of money for these purposes. Joe was proud that the business was booming and bringing in a tangible income, about $1 million a year. Back home, the newlyweds bought an expensive Mercedes car. The new convertible cost them $100,000. Since Olga did not belong to those women who are happy to sit on the neck of her husband, she began to help her husband. Olga was well-educated and well-read, well-versed in English, and also had an unprecedented charm. In addition, the past experience of working on the stock exchange came in handy. Therefore, she easily entered the business and engaged in administration. As soon as the lovely blonde took up the business, Joe and Chris had a lot more clients. A week before the attack near the condominium, someone broke into the home of a young family. While the couple were busy doing business, an unknown person stole jewelry and family heirlooms. The diamond ring was Olga's that day. After the Connell couple returned home, the head of the family noticed the illegal intrusion and called the police. Law enforcement officers examined the scene and surprisingly did not find any evidence. The search for the burglar yielded no solid results. Detectives put forward a version that the robbery was the result of someone staging or the work of a professional. That's why Kelly was under a lot of suspicion. As many believed, the sister had every reason to stage the crime. Perhaps over time, she could not forgive her brother for what he had done and decided to teach him a lesson. However, soon the investigation of the case came to a dead end. A more terrible crime happened to the spouses, and all the attention of detectives shifted to the investigation of a double crime. Search for motive. When detectives interviewed Kelly, she looked grief-stricken. The woman cooperated with the investigation and didn't hide anything. She told about the conflict with Joe and even showed correspondence about it. In one of the messages, Olga expressed the opinion that the recent robbery was organized by Kelly herself. However, Kelly denied it, but the investigation could not exclude her from the number of suspects, and, as the woman later admitted, exerted powerful pressure in some places. Despite the obvious motive, all the facts were to the contrary. At none of the interrogations did the victim's younger sister change her testimony, nor was she confused. During Joe and Olga's funeral, the sister looked broken. It was obvious that she loved her brother and was grieving the loss. At the same time, other versions of the murder were being considered. Joseph Connell belonged to the number of enviable grooms, and his wife was a rare beauty. Therefore, jealousy was not ruled out as a motive for the crime. Perhaps not everyone around the couple shared their happiness, and some of the former young people could hold a grudge, and after their marriage, to take revenge in life. However, the suspicions of detectives were not confirmed. During the investigation, it was found that Joe parted with his former companions on a good note. Moreover, they have long married and are happily married. This applies to Olga's past relationships as well. She divorced her Russian husband and cut off all contacts. However, an offended man would hardly take any measures to settle accounts with his ex-wife, and even more so, to travel a great distance across the ocean to do so. In this regard, this theory has been ruled out. Nevertheless, the search for enemies of newlyweds continued. At the same time, the investigators did not give rest to the subject of discord between brother and sister. Greed is a common reason for committing a crime. Therefore, after questioning Kelly, the investigation focused on Garrett Catalano, her husband. The man loved his wife very much and would do anything for her. It is likely that at the request of his beloved, he could have gone for a double crime. During the conversation, the potential suspect behaved calmly and convincingly. It turns out that he had a reliable alibi and also confirmed the innocence of his wife. However, Garrett expressed doubts that his brother-in-law made a multi-million-dollar fortune by honest labor. Catalano opaquely hinted that Joe may have been dealing in illegal substances. Over time, his words took hold. There were others who claimed that Joe was secretly selling steroids and making mad money from it. Secret witnesses identified another man we know as one of his associates. Thus, the detectives came upon a longtime friend and business partner, Christopher Rivers, best friend. Chris, unlike everyone around him, didn't seem to be worried about what had happened. He continued to lead his usual life. It was understandable that he had the double responsibility for the business. Meetings with suppliers, work with clients made him hold on, but still, his irrepressible vigor and strength of mind led to strange thoughts. One day, the investigators decided to talk to the man. He said that on the ill-fated night he was supposed to be present at the celebration, but could not show up because he was busy at work. Despite a long friendship and the premature death of his partner, Christopher unexpectedly spoke out unflatteringly. He said that Joseph had changed recently and was apparently unscrupulous. Rivers did not avoid Olga. Allegedly, he heard that the wife of Joe was not as simple as she wanted to seem and came to the U.S. to represent the interests of the Russian mafia. And a successful marriage only untied her hands. The words of the companion explained the high income of the family, but his suspicions needed careful verification. Perhaps everything the man said was just rumor and speculation. Or maybe there was a good reason for it. However, Joseph's connection to the underworld soon became apparent. The information was not a secret and was publicly available. It turns out that a few years before meeting with Olga, her lover was accused of illegal possession of weapons, and even served a decent term for it. During his time in prison, the man managed to acquire new acquaintances. It is not excluded that after serving his sentence, local authorities pulled him into the trade in illegal substances. Perhaps over time, Connell crossed someone's path and they decided to take him out. But could the connections acquired behind bars have been the motive for the attack? The investigation was gathering momentum. While the detectives were working on the shady business, an interesting point came to light. Harry Cook, a well-known drug dealer, said he had heard Rivers make negative remarks about Joe on more than one occasion. Rivers accused his business partner of stealing. Chris Rivers admitted to him that he and his companion were selling illegal medical drugs through an auto parts store. But the buddy is greedy and distributes the profits unequally, while Chris is in greater need of money and has huge debts. And Joseph himself spends all the finances on an idle life. For this reason, Rivers joked that he wouldn't mind if his friend disappeared, and later seriously asked Harry if he wanted to help him in this, to which the latter replied no. Thus, the identity of Rivers appeared in a different light. In this regard, the investigation repeatedly questioned Chris. However, he had an alibi. At the time of the murder, the man was at home, which was confirmed by external and internal video surveillance cameras. At the same time, specialists decided to check his censures and studied the accounting documents of the firm. It turned out that, despite the large revenue, the business did suffer losses. However, as it turned out, numerous embezzlements have nothing to do with Connell. It was the stipulator himself who was responsible. Police informants reported that Chris has been using heavy substances for a long time, and lately his addiction has gotten out of control. This explains the numerous debts and shoplifting. Against this background, the man developed paranoia. That's why he repeatedly confessed to acquaintances that they want to kill him. In addition, it became known that he was personally involved in the sale of steroids, and Joe blindly believed his comrade and was in the dark about what was happening in front of his nose. In addition, Joe's attention turned to the new relationship. This information became known thanks to the information of a mysterious informant, a sick mind. Detectives came upon the man after examining Rivers' phone records. He was known to make a lot of phone calls on the night of September 23rd. Despite being at home at the time of the crime, his phone did not go silent. All calls were subsequently cleared from the device, but experts had no trouble reconstructing the story. Most of the calls belonged to Joshua, a former FBI informant. When police contacted Joshua, he admitted that he often used Rivers' services. One day, Chris Rivers made him a tempting offer, $65,000 for his companion's head. The big money undoubtedly attracted the man. However, Joshua did not want to participate in the case directly and found other hitmen. To this end, he turned to Dominic Benson and Aaron Thompson. Mercenaries cost him $5,000, which he received from the customer as an advance payment. Eventually, the confusing crime picture came to light. The best friend had sentenced his buddy and his spouse to a sad end. Was the motive behind the crime a grudge and a desire for sole ownership of a shared business? No, it was the $1 million that one of the partners was entitled to as an insurance payout. It turned out that long before the appearance of Olga, the former partners had secured the business and insured their lives. In the event of the death of one of them, the other received the amount to pay off the mortgage on the machine shop. If Joe died, the amount received would be enough to pay off all of Chris's debts. But here's the problem. His partner got married, and all payments were due to the legal spouse. So Rivers decided to take out two of them at once. The conversation that took place between the organizer and his accomplice on the night of the crime indirectly confirmed this. Although the communications between the men were encrypted, it was obvious that Rivers was concerned about the success of the operation. To better analyze the communication between the two men, detectives seized phones from the four suspects. Thanks to the mobile devices, their movements on the night of the crime were recorded. Dominic and Aaron were at that moment near the house of the young couple Connell. Curiously, the video footage that confirmed Chris's alibi played against him. The cameras show that the man is nervous and does not let the phone out of his hands. After detectives reached out to Joshua, he didn't put up a fight and surrendered to authorities. To mitigate his punishment, during the interrogation, the man agreed to a deal with the investigation and testified against the customer. Thus, Christopher came up with a cunning plan. He wanted to use the quarrel between his brother and sister to frame Kelly. During the investigation, it was proved that the robbery at the Connell house was the next stage of the criminal plot. Following Christopher's instructions, Joshua broke into the couple's home and burglarized it. However, the head of the target was a controversial family heirloom, a diamond ring. Coincidentally, Olga was wearing it that day. If the plan had succeeded, the investigation would have followed a false trail and blamed everything on Joe's sister. But this was not enough for Rivers, and after the crime, he tried to blacken the name of his friend. As it turned out later, the death of Joe and his lover was the result of a cold-blooded and carefully planned crime for money, justice. In 2014, Chris Rivers was indicted on several charges. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony, as well as conspiracy in the first degree and solicitation of a felony in the first degree. His co-defendants were also tried. The trials took place separately but parallel to each other. During the trial, it was proven that Aaron Thompson was the one who held the weapon. He was therefore found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony, and first-degree conspiracy. The felon received 2 life sentences and plus 45 years. His buddy Dominic Benson was acquitted on the felony charge because he changed his mind about shooting at the last minute. Therefore, for first-degree conspiracy and aiding and abetting criminals, he received only 5 years in prison. Thanks to his active cooperation with the police for the murder conspiracy, Joshua got the same sentence. As for the main instigator of the crime, Chris Rivers, he was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to 2 life sentences plus 50 years. "We can forgive another person anything but success," goes the famous saying. Despite his young age, Joseph was a remarkable man. He built a business, found the love of his life, except that he was not left with the opportunity to enjoy happiness. Together, the couple could reach new heights, build a strong family, and have heirs. However, the thirst for profit and the dislike of his partner made irreparable adjustments to their measured life. Money, one of the old and common motives for crime. Christopher's pernicious addiction and greed ruined several lives. During his years in prison, the convict will surely be cured of his pernicious addiction to substances. But will he be able to stifle the guilt that is supposed to come with time? Unknown. Or maybe in his case, the voice of conscience will never be heard. After all, not everyone dares to spend the rest of his life in a constant struggle with himself. Behind closed doors, you never really know what's happening in someone's home. Sometimes, not even the closest relatives or friends have a clue. What may look like a picture-perfect family from the outside could be hiding a deadly threat behind the scenes. Often people are too scared to share their troubles, not wanting to burden or upset their loved ones. It feels easier to face hardships alone than to drag others into their pain. But what happens when the issue is domestic violence? What if the partner feels untouchable, already instilling fear and submission in their significant other? In situations like this, victims often find themselves equally afraid of the physical abuse as they are of their partner leaving. The story of Yulia Fairman shocked the entire city of Samara in January 2013 when a well-known young businessman brutally took the life of his wife and tried to make it look like a suicide. The case stirred up public outrage after it was revealed that the perpetrator faced absolutely no consequences for his crime. Alexandra Fairman was found guilty of taking the life of the mother of his child, but somehow the investigation's findings mysteriously shifted, and the incident was chalked up to a state of temporary insanity. Now, 11 years later, Yulia's family is still fighting to find justice and see her killer punished. Yulia and Alexander A love story. Yulia Sergeyevna Fairman, née Naumova, was born on August 21st, 1986, in the city of Samara, located in the Middle Volga region of Russia. She came from a humble working-class family. Her father, Sergei Naumov, worked as a driver, and her mother, Lyudmila Ivanovna, was employed in the food service industry. Yulia's childhood wasn't easy, but her parents did everything they could to ensure she never went without. They were determined to give her a good upbringing and the best education they could afford. In 1993, Yulia started attending Samara's public school #67, where she graduated in 2003. With her diploma in hand, she went on to study management at the Faculty of Economics and Management at Samara State Academy. She earned her degree in 2007, and soon after, she landed a job at a major local car dealership called VIP Auto. It was here that she met a young man named Alexander, and their romantic journey began. Alexander Mikhailovich Fairman was also a native of Samara. He was born in 1985 into a well-off family. During the 1990s, his father, Mikhail Fairman, amassed a fortune in the farming business. He became one of the wealthiest and most well-known figures in the city, raising cattle, owning factories that produced dairy products sold nationwide, and running beekeeping operations to sell honey and other bee products. His biggest success, however, came with the establishment of LLC Teplishny, one of the most successful agricultural enterprises in the Samara region and the entire Volga Economic District. After finishing college, Alexander also briefly worked at the VIP Auto dealership where he met Yulia. The young, beautiful woman immediately caught his eye and he began courting her. Unfortunately for Yulia, she responded to his attention, and they started a whirlwind romance that felt like a fairy tale at first. The couple dated for about a year and a half until, in 2009, Alexander officially proposed. According to friends and family, Alexander orchestrated a romantic surprise for Yulia when he proposed. He visited her unannounced, led her to the window, and gave a signal to his friends waiting outside. They released a balloon that had a small box attached to it, containing a beautiful engagement ring. He caught the balloon, slipped the ring onto her finger, and asked her to become his wife. Overwhelmed with happiness, Yulia couldn't hold back her tears and said yes. The wedding took place later in 2009, shortly after their engagement. Alexander's parents spared no expense, throwing their beloved son a lavish celebration. They organized a massive party with a long guest list, a giant Hummer limousine, the city's most prestigious banquet hall, a trendy master of ceremonies, and an epic fireworks display to close out the evening. Yulia's bridesmaids recalled how she glowed with joy, looking every bit like a fairy tale princess. Married life. To outsiders, the couple's life seemed picture perfect and happy. They had a well-furnished apartment on Stavropolskaya Street, and they were living comfortably without any financial worries. By then, Alexander had started working at his father's company, LLC Teplishny, where he took on the role of executive director. Soon after their wedding, the couple started thinking about growing their family. However, for over a year, Yulia couldn't get pregnant. Now, Alexander's relatives claimed that the first real cracks in their marriage began showing during this time. But when the pregnancy test finally displayed those two long-awaited lines, they both believed that the arrival of a baby would save their marriage and strengthen their bond. Based on the joyful photos Yulia shared on social media, it was clear they were eagerly anticipating the arrival of their child. On September 6, 2011, Yulia gave birth to a baby boy, whom they named Pavel. A few days later, Yulia posted on her social media, thanking everyone for their well wishes and announcing that the baby was born weighing 9 pounds 6 ounces and measuring 23.6 inches in length. During her maternity leave, Yulia cherished every moment with her baby, as evidenced by the numerous photos of her and little Pavel. From the outside, her life looked like a dream: a loving husband, a healthy baby, a cozy home, financial security, and a strong family. Many of her friends envied her, but everything came crashing down in an instant, and the illusion of a perfect family vanished like smoke. The terrifying late-night call. In the early hours of January 4th, a phone call shattered the silence in the Naumov household. Half asleep, Lyudmila Ivanovna picked up the phone, not fully comprehending what was being said. It was her son-in-law Alexander on the other end, coldly informing her that Yulia was no longer alive. It felt like the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. She couldn't believe it, thinking it must be some kind of cruel, senseless joke. She started screaming and crying, which brought her terrified husband rushing in. From that moment, everything felt like a nightmare. According to Lyudmila Ivanovna, she and her husband quickly threw on some clothes, rushed outside, and flagged down the first car that came by, begging the driver to take them to their daughter's apartment. Within about 15 minutes, they arrived at the building on Stavropolskaya Street, where an ambulance was already parked near one of the entrances. Barely aware of herself, Lyudmila ran to the paramedics, but they just shrugged, offering their condolences and telling her there was nothing more they could do. Outside stood Yulia's mother-in-law, Elena Fairman, holding little Pasha, their 1.5-year-old grandson. Desperate for answers, Lyudmila ran over to her, but all she could gather from Helena's words was that Yulia was gone. The Naumovs then made their way up to the apartment, and what they saw was horrifying. There were faint bloodstains on the floor leading to the bathroom. Inside, lying on the floor by the door, was the lifeless body of their daughter. Her hair was tangled and matted with blood, covering her face. Her mother couldn't bring herself to approach. She started to lose consciousness and had to be carried into another room. When Lyudmila Ivanovna regained some composure, her son-in-law, Alexander, came over, thrusting a phone in her face, insisting she take a look at what her daughter had done. She could barely make sense of anything around her, but he kept pushing until she finally took the phone. Struggling to focus, she read a strange farewell letter. In this message, Yulia supposedly confessed to cheating on her husband 6 months earlier and said she couldn't forgive herself. She wrote that she didn't know how she could go on if her actions destroyed her family and ruined their child's life. The odd crime scene. At first, Alexander claimed that Yulia had taken her own life. He said that she had been overwhelmed with guilt over her alleged affair, and it consumed her to the point that she couldn't cope anymore. According to him, she had acted strangely that evening. They argued, and afterward, Yulia went into the bathroom. After some time, he noticed she'd been in there too long. When she didn't respond to his knocks, he opened the door to find her hanging from the doorknob, a hairdryer cord wrapped around her neck. He claims he tried to revive her by performing CPR, but when he realized there was nothing he could do, he called emergency services and his parents to help with the child. Only after paramedics confirmed that Yulia was gone did Alexander call his mother-in-law to inform her of what had happened. He remained in the apartment the whole time, interacting with the medical personnel and law enforcement who arrived on the scene. However, Alexander didn't behave like a grieving widower. He seemed disturbingly calm, but once Lyudmila Ivanovna arrived, he grew visibly irritated. He showed no sympathy for her. In fact, he seemed intent on making her pain even worse. Yet what truly caught the investigators' attention wasn't Alexander's odd behavior, but the state of Yulia's body. Forensic experts discovered 2 ligature marks on her neck. One was very pronounced, suggesting she had been strangled. The second mark, faint and at a different angle, indicated hanging, but seemed to have appeared after she had already died. Additionally, there were numerous other injuries on her body in various stages of healing, but more on that later. Another curious detail. Upon discovering his wife's body, Alexander's first call was not to the emergency services, but to his parents and a relative who worked at the hospital. They arrived at the scene even before the paramedics did. What was wrong with the farewell message? When her son-in-law first showed Lyudmila Ivanovna the message on her daughter's phone, she was in a state of shock, barely processing anything after losing her daughter. From the start, she doubted that her daughter had written that message, and she had good reasons to think so. First, Yulia had never sent her mother a text message before, knowing that due to her poor eyesight, her mom didn't read texts at all. Second, Yulia never addressed her mother in the way the farewell note did. Third, Lyudmila was absolutely certain that her daughter would never leave her child behind. Her whole life revolved around him. Moreover, experts determined that the message was sent after Yulia's heart had already stopped beating. Alexander explained this by claiming that Yulia might have typed the message and left it in drafts. And when he was trying to call for medical help, he accidentally sent his wife's final message to her mother without realizing how it happened. Additionally, Yulia's phone revealed a chat with a close friend, where she confided about problems in her marriage and her husband's violent behavior. Although she didn't go into much detail, it was clear she was afraid of Alexander. In one of her last messages, Yulia wrote that she would stay strong for her son, as she couldn't leave him and absolutely couldn't afford to die. The initial theory. After examining Yulia's body and the crime scene, investigators concluded that this wasn't a case of suicide, but a crime that had been poorly staged to look like one. Alexander immediately became the prime suspect, was taken into custody, and sent to a detention center while the investigation unfolded. At first, Alexander continued to insist that his wife had taken her own life. He accused her of infidelity, claiming that guilt and remorse drove her to such a desperate act. However, the forensic report clearly indicated that Yulia had been violently killed. According to the preliminary theory, on the evening of January 3rd, the couple got into a heated argument over a trivial matter. During the altercation, Alexander beat and strangled his wife, then tried to stage her death as a suicide. On January 18th, he was officially charged with the crime. His detention period was extended, and the investigation continued. Soon after, Alexander admitted that he and his wife had a big fight that night. He confessed to hitting her and grabbing a hairdryer that was nearby, but claimed he couldn't remember what happened next. He only came to his senses when he saw Yulia lying lifeless, blood on the floor, and the hairdryer cord around her neck. Alexander stated that his only concern at that moment was to make sure their 1.5-year-old son, Pavel, wouldn't wake up and see what had happened. After managing to put their son to sleep, Alexander started cleaning the bloodstains off the floor. He then moved his wife's body to the bathroom, where he hung it from the hairdryer cord on the door handle to make it look like a suicide. He insisted that he couldn't remember how he did all this, claiming he had some sort of memory blackout. The first psychological and psychiatric evaluation concluded that Alexander was fully sane at the time of the crime and was fully aware of his actions. However, in the months that followed, things began to take a dramatic turn. The funeral and custody battle. On January 5th, Yulia's body was brought home from the morgue to prepare for her funeral. That same day, Alexander's parents came to the Naumovs' apartment asking for forgiveness for their son and themselves as much as they could be forgiven. After that, they left, and neither they nor anyone else from the Fairman family attended the memorial service or the burial. The funeral took place the next day, on January 6th. More than 100 people came to pay their respects to the young woman taken too soon, but not a single member of the Fairman family showed up. A few days later, after starting to come to terms with her grief, Lyudmila Ivanovna began the process of seeking custody of her grandson. She went to the proper authorities, who informed her about the documents and paperwork she needed to gather. For several weeks, she visited various specialists, including doctors and psychologists, but once all the documents were ready, Lyudmila received an unexpected refusal. The child welfare authorities decided to leave little Pasha with his paternal grandparents because they were wealthy and could provide a more comfortable lifestyle for him. The young boy now lived in a large suburban cottage in the Volsky district, and Lyudmila and her husband were only allowed to take their grandson on weekends, which they did as often as possible. So, who was really cheating? That farewell message found on Yulia's phone was written and sent by her husband, the killer, as noted earlier, after she had already died. Despite Alexander denying this repeatedly, there was no doubt about it. He simply made up a fictional lover to frame the tragedy as the consequence of a guilty, unfaithful wife's remorse. He created and typed the text on the fly. A thorough investigation and witness interviews revealed that Yulia had no and couldn't have had any affairs. After giving birth to her son, she devoted herself entirely to him, spending every moment by his side and hardly ever leaving him. She was even willing to endure the beatings from her abusive husband just to keep the family together, hoping that things would eventually get better for little Pasha's sake. As for Alexander, he wasn't so innocent. He had been having an affair, not even bothering to hide it. He was seen multiple times with a young woman who lived nearby, and their relationship was clearly more than just friendly or neighborly. According to Elena, Yulia's cousin, she had seen Alexander and this woman embracing in his car shortly before the tragedy, but she only shared this with her mother, who later confirmed it. On New Year's Eve, Alexander started an argument with his wife, then left to celebrate the holiday with friends. And the same woman, Yulia, not wanting to upset her parents, kept this to herself but confided in her best friend, someone she could always trust. The new evaluation changed everything. A second psychological evaluation conducted in May 2013 suddenly concluded that Alexander was in a state of temporary insanity when he committed the crime against his wife. As a result, the charge of murder, which carried a sentence of up to 15 years in prison, was reclassified to a crime committed in a state of temporary insanity, instantly reducing the potential sentence to just 3 years. For some reason, nobody seemed bothered by the fact that, after killing his wife, Alexander had gone to great lengths to stage her death as a suicide, which is not typical behavior for someone in a state of temporary insanity. He washed the floor to hide evidence of the beating and even sent a fake farewell message to Yulia's mother, pretending it was from her. The lawyer's moves and the custody battle. Alexander's lawyer immediately pushed to change the conditions of his client's detention, and by the end of May, Alexander was released under a travel restriction order. Essentially, this meant he was free to walk around and continue his life while awaiting trial. Yulia's parents were devastated by this decision and appealed to the prosecutor's office, demanding a third psychological evaluation. This time, specialists from the Serbsky State Research Center for Social and Forensic Psychiatry in Moscow were brought in, and it took about 3 months to get the results. However, the psychiatrists only reaffirmed that the accused had acted in a state of temporary insanity. As for the original evaluation, which indicated that Alexander had been fully aware and had intentionally tried to cover up the crime, it was claimed that the specialists had simply made an error, misinterpreting the accused's actions and behavior. Meanwhile, Alexander repeatedly changed his statements, describing his condition that night in a way that sounded straight out of a textbook definition of temporary insanity. The trial begins. The first hearing in the Fairmont case took place on January 22, 2014, at the Kirovsky District Court in Samara. According to Alexander, the problems in their relationship began even before the wedding, when they moved in together. He claimed that Yulia had a sense of entitlement and high expectations, demanding only the best. He said that the extravagant wedding, the expensive limousine, and all the luxuries were her whims, which he and his parents catered to. Alexander said that after the wedding, he and Yulia tried unsuccessfully for over a year to conceive a child, which worsened their relationship, and Yulia even started talking about divorce. When their son Pavel was finally born, things didn't improve. The defendant claimed that his wife was completely consumed by the baby and had no interest in him, caring only about his paycheck. Alexander's parents backed up his claims, accusing their daughter-in-law of being greedy and materialistic. Alexander described a stifling atmosphere at home that kept escalating, saying that his once-beloved wife had grown distant and he had no one to talk to about it. On the night in question, the young businessman said he and his wife had another huge fight, during which she brought up divorce again. According to him, she started yelling that she would take their son and prevent him from seeing the boy. At this point, Alexander claimed he felt his mouth go dry, his ears started ringing, and then he blacked out. When he came to, Yulia was already dead, He admitted that he carried her body to the bathroom and cleaned the blood off the floor to avoid scaring their son, but he didn't explain why he decided to stage her death as a suicide. The defendant also continued to deny ever hitting his wife, dismissing the numerous bruises and cuts on her body as the result of playing rough with their child. It was clear that Alexander and the lawyer hired by his wealthy father had prepared well. The defense attorney argued that his client had committed the crime under a cumulative state of temporary insanity. This meant that Yulia had allegedly insulted, humiliated, and oppressed him for a long period, creating a state of constant psychological tension. In other words, they were essentially blaming the victim for her own tragic fate. Initially, the prosecutor sought an 8-year sentence for intentional manslaughter. However, the seasoned defense attorney quickly managed to get the charge downgraded back to a crime committed in a state of temporary insanity, reducing Alexander's maximum possible sentence to just 3 years in a penal colony. A slap on the wrist for a killer. Throughout the trial, there were several odd occurrences. First, the forensic psychologist from the original panel, who had concluded that the defendant acted intentionally and was fully sane, suddenly vanished and never reappeared in court. Then, any mention of the bruises and cuts on the victim's body seemed to disappear, as if they had never existed or were somehow deemed irrelevant. Meanwhile, the victim herself was increasingly portrayed in a negative light at every hearing. On August 8, 2014, Alexander Mikhailovich Fairman was found guilty of a crime committed in the state of temporary insanity and was sentenced to just 2.5 years of probation. In other words, he didn't serve any jail time. He went back home, with his only punishment being the requirement to regularly check in with the Federal Penal Service and pay 1 million rubles in moral damages to Yulia's parents, despite the prosecution originally seeking 3 times that amount. The court took into account Alexander's supposed remorse, including the fact that he had apologized to his in-laws and that he had a young son to support. However, the Naumovs immediately announced their intention to appeal the sentence, even aiming to take it to the Supreme Court. Nevertheless, their appeals were dismissed. Their attempt to challenge the verdict at the Samara Regional Court's cassation instance was also unsuccessful. The sentence remained unchanged. Lyudmila Ivanovna pointed out that the Russian Criminal Code provides a harsher punishment, including actual prison time for animal cruelty. The grieving mother couldn't understand why her daughter's life was valued even less than that of a stray dog, and she continues to hope for justice. Over 11 years have passed since the tragedy, yet the case remains stagnant. According to Fairman's lawyer, Galina Kizlyakova, there was never any evidence that the crime was premeditated, and therefore the court's verdict stands. She considers the victim's mother's complaints to be baseless and purely emotional, lacking any legal substance. At the mercy of the elements. The world is such that accidents can happen anywhere. Even the simplest, most routine situation can turn disastrous. We take risks every day, yet naively believe we control everything. Some people intentionally invite risk into their lives. For some, it becomes a constant pursuit tied to their professional activities, while others occasionally seek a thrill. Extreme hobbies like skydiving, rock climbing, caving, parkour, and more fall into this category. Diving is also on the list of dangerous pastimes. The desire to explore the ocean depths is understandable. Water and its inhabitants have always attracted both researchers and ordinary people. The vastness of the water space, far larger than land, adds to its intrigue. Diving is one of the most popular activities, but it's not the safest. Many things can go wrong. Oxygen deprivation, barotrauma, encounters with dangerous animals or strong currents, and more. The most unexpected thing can happen. You could be forgotten during an underwater excursion. What may seem like a joke at first is actually a reality. The story of the Lonergan family is a tragic confirmation of this. Though the events occurred back in 1998, and many safety protocols have since been implemented to prevent such occurrences, this story still chills to the bone. Imagine the horror experienced by the two spouses left alone at sea. A quarter of a century has passed since then, yet many continue to debate what really happened to the couple. Was their disappearance the result of tragic negligence or a deliberate decision to end their lives? Let's try to figure this out together. The long-awaited dive. On January 25, 1998, Thomas and Eileen Lonergan left their hostel in the Australian town of Cairns. Leaving the northeastern part of Queensland behind, the young couple headed further north to Port Douglas. Their goal, a long-anticipated dive into the waters of the Great Barrier Reef. The world's largest coral reef system had long been a magnet for avid divers. At the designated location, the 33-year-old man and 28-year-old woman boarded the boat Outer Edge, along with other like-minded individuals. A total of 13 pairs set out that day to St. Crispin's Reef. The one-day excursion, costing around $100, was full of promise. The package included 3 dives in a picturesque and safe location, all under the supervision of an experienced crew. It's worth noting that the company providing underwater tourism services was considered one of the best and had years of experience, so travelers could pursue their dreams with peace of mind. The weather on January 25th was ideal for the tourists. By all accounts, it was a perfect day for scuba diving. The water at the dive site was pleasantly warm. From the start, the couple declined the services of guide Catherine Traverso, relying on their extensive experience. The Lonergans had completed 160 dives in their lifetime and were considered seasoned divers. The boat's passengers donned their gear and jumped into the coral sea. The diversity of flora and fauna was stunning. The Great Barrier Reef is home to around 1,500 species of fish and 400 types of coral. When the dive time was up, a signal sounded from the boat, clearly audible underwater, indicating it was time to surface. Afterward, everyone emerged and returned to the vessel. Around 3 p.m., the protagonists of this story took their third dive, descending to a depth of 39 feet. The underwater tour was coming to an end, and time flew by unnoticed. Within an hour, everyone was back on board. According to the crew, a head count was conducted, and the number of divers matched the original count, 26 people. That evening, the Outer Edge arrived in Port Douglas, but not all the divers disembarked. It turned out several tourists were missing. However, what was more horrifying was that no one had noticed this. The same applied to the 2 bags that remained on board. To this day, it's unclear how the crew miscounted the passengers and failed to notice the belongings left behind. One way or another, the missing individuals were Thomas and Eileen Lonergan, together forever. Thomas and Eileen met while studying at Louisiana State University, where Eileen was learning the basics of scuba diving. They instantly liked each other and began dating. The couple was deeply in love and inseparable. They went camping, swam in the ocean, and attended parties together. Their relationship was admired by many and seemed ideal. Some even envied their genuine love. No matter what they did it together. Eileen had a great passion for diving. She spoke about it with such enthusiasm that Thomas couldn't resist and soon shared his beloved's interest. Over time, the young couple earned their certification in this field. Eventually, on June 24, 1988, they sealed their union in marriage. The wedding took place in Jefferson, Texas. Since both were born and raised in Louisiana and had never traveled abroad, they dreamed of seeing the world. Thomas and Eileen were also known for their kindness and compassion, so when they were offered the opportunity to join the Peace Corps, they eagerly agreed. The Lonergans were perfect candidates for this role. During their student years, they participated in numerous charity projects and events, offering help to those in need. The Peace Corps, an independent U.S. government agency, sends volunteers to assist struggling countries, promoting friendship and peace worldwide. After a successful internship in Tuvalu, a country in Polynesia, the couple moved on to Fiji, where they taught children from impoverished families. At the time of these events, they had been married for 10 years. By then, they had completed their mission and were planning to return to the U.S. However, the Lonergans had one more wish: a world cruise. They wanted to visit famous places and take in the local beauty. Their return home was scheduled for March 1999, but first they had a long and exciting journey ahead, the Great Barrier Reef. As avid divers, the couple had long dreamed of seeing the wonders of the Great Barrier Reef. This is why they ended up in Australia. The local attraction is renowned worldwide. Did you know it's the largest coral reef system on the planet? Created by marine organisms, it's a truly unique natural marvel. Its area surpasses the size of some countries and is even visible from space. The Lonergans wanted to capture this wonder in their memories forever, knowing it might not last. You can't imagine how Thomas and Eileen saw it back in 1998. Today, much of the ecosystem has vanished. Once vibrant and diverse, the corals have become bleached. While not dead, they are at high risk of disappearing forever if they become diseased or are exposed to destructive external forces. Even a slight rise in water temperature can cause this. For optimal coral growth, water temperatures need to be between 72 and 81 degrees Fahrenheit. The beauty of the Great Barrier Reef can still be enjoyed today, but in the face of the greenhouse effect, its days are numbered. A significant coral bleaching event occurred in 1997 to 1998, which is why our couple was in such a hurry. They rushed to see the reef while it was still alive, only to encounter death instead. Criminal negligence. Based on general knowledge and film scenarios, we can imagine the scene that unfolded before the couple after they surfaced. An endless sea stretched around them, with no sign of the only symbol of safety, the outer edge boat. Two young people, without food or water, were left alone amidst the vast ocean. Surrounding them were threats in the form of dangerous sharks, the blazing sun, and the risk of dehydration. The desperate divers could only hope that their disappearance would be noticed and that they would be rescued in time. After all, according to the rules, the number of people on board must be counted multiple times, before the dive and after. Even if a miscount occurred, records should be made upon surfacing about the dive depth, air levels in the tanks, and so on. In short, the required documentation should have been kept. In the end, even if none of this had been done, the Lonergans' personal belongings remained on board, which surely couldn't have gone unnoticed. Initially, the couple likely thought it was a funny mistake, something they would laugh about later when telling their friends. But as the hours passed, nothing changed. Two at sea. The realization of the inevitable came slowly. No one wants to believe in the worst until the very end. Over time, the forgotten couple began to assess their situation more clearly. In reality, Thomas and Eileen could do nothing. There was no one in sight, and calling for help was pointless. Swimming to shore was equally impossible. There were no islands nearby. Despite being experienced divers, it was unrealistic to cover the 60-mile distance to land. Adding to their fears was the fact that Australia is home to the largest and most vicious sharks in the world. It wouldn't take much for these predators to attack the stranded tourists and deal with them. The couple had no tools to defend themselves from this looming threat. Nor did they have any water or food with them. It is known that the average life expectancy without water is 2 to 4 days. For some, this period may stretch a few extra days. While a person can survive much longer without food, water is essential. Without it, dehydration sets in after 5 to 7 days. How long a person can endure without sustenance depends on their health, body mass, willpower, and the climate. Regardless, death under these conditions is slow and agonizing. On top of that, they faced scorching heat, increasing the likelihood of sunstroke or heat exhaustion. The only two comforting thoughts at that moment were these. First, they were not alone in this situation, but together, as they had always been. Second, as divers, they were unlikely to drown. Their gear included buoyancy compensators, which are much more reliable than life jackets. The next danger they faced came in the form of strong winds and powerful currents. They were being carried farther and farther away. Even if someone began searching for them after a while, they would no longer be in the same location. The most tragic aspect, however, was that there were pontoons just 1.5 to 2 miles away. These floating platforms, anchored to the ocean floor, provide a place to rest. Had the Lonergans known about this, things could have been very different. They could have waited for help in relative safety, resting, and even sleeping. But alas, a different fate awaited them. The couple was being swept into open waters, farther from any chance of rescue. With about 5 hours left until sunset, night, the most dangerous time, was approaching. For when everything sleeps, the sea comes alive. A chance at rescue. At this time, the 24 passengers of the Outer Edge and the crew had all disembarked. The exhausted tourists headed to their hotel rooms, and the boat's crew returned home to their families. No one gave a thought to anything being wrong. No one cared about the belongings left aboard. Everyone was simply tired after a busy day and eager for rest. The next day brought no significant changes. However, there was one moment that should have drawn attention. Another group of divers visited the Great Barrier Reef. The familiar boat pulled up to its usual spot, and the tourists descended into the water. Upon resurfacing, one of them told a crew member that they had noticed diving weights on the ocean floor. These weights, part of a diver's equipment, are used to counteract buoyancy. Most likely, the discovered gear belonged to Thomas and Eileen, who had detached them. But the crew member didn't take the information seriously, chalking it up as an interesting find. Yet such items don't simply lie around on the ocean floor for no reason. The negligent worker should have treated the discovery with the attention and caution it deserved. Unfortunately, another mistake and act of negligence occurred. Had an alarm been raised, perhaps the search for the missing couple would have started sooner, and they might have survived. The cruel irony of fate, waiting for help and fighting for your life while people and a boat are not far away. Sadly, this is often the case. Life and death walk side by side. 2 days later. On January 27th, during the cleaning of the boat, someone finally noticed the forgotten belongings. Curious to find out who they belonged to, the bag was opened, revealing dry clothes, a wallet, and documents in the names of Thomas and Eileen Lonergan. The crew remembered seeing the couple 2 days prior. During that time, no one had come to claim the items, which was quite strange. This is when things started to become clear. The skipper who made the discovery immediately reported everything to the police. The investigation began right away. Everyone understood the gravity of 2 tourists disappearing. Law enforcement officers checked the missing couple's hotel room. Unsurprisingly, there were no guests inside. The hotel staff confirmed they had seen the couple before their trip on Sunday morning. After that, they never returned. However, no one had raised any alarms since the room had been prepaid, and it was assumed their excursion could have lasted several days. Tension mounted. The police interviewed the Outer Edge crew, as well as all the passengers from the past few days. It became apparent that no one had seen Thomas and Eileen for quite some time. Moreover, no one could recall if they had even come ashore. Each tourist had been busy with their own activities. The crew insisted that they had counted everyone before heading to shore, but perhaps they had counted the same couple twice. However, some tourists pointed out they hadn't noticed any counting at all, at least not out loud. The discovery of the weight belt was also mentioned. The search. Things were looking bad. To organize a large-scale search, the police called for triple reinforcements. 17 planes and 2 helicopters were dispatched. The Coast Guard, several private boats, and concerned citizens all joined the search effort. The area where the tourists had been left was scoured thoroughly. Over time, the search zone shifted. In 2 days, the current had carried the couple far away. Throughout all of this, Port Douglas was in an uproar. Everyone was shocked by the incident, holding out hope for a positive outcome. However, many understood that the chances of rescue after such a long period of inactivity were slim to none. The company that had organized the excursion realized the gravity of the situation and prepared to bear responsibility. The boat's crew knew they had been outrageously careless and negligent. Nothing could justify it. The large-scale search lasted 5 days. Continuing beyond that seemed pointless. By this time, anything could have happened to the couple. In the end, they could have died from dehydration or been attacked. The evidence. Supporting this, on February 5, 1998, a buoyancy compensator washed ashore near Indian Head, more than 100 miles north of Port Douglas. It was found to contain a tag with the name Thomas Lonergan. Interestingly, no bite marks from predators were found on it. This is when the case of the couple's disappearance became more convoluted. Shortly after, Eileen's wetsuit and a second buoyancy compensator presumed to be hers were also found. The wetsuit had cuts on it, leading some to suspect they were caused by shark teeth. However, if that had been the case, it's unlikely that anything would have been left of the suit. Later, forensic experts determined the tears were caused by coral. The wetsuit had even accumulated barnacles, indicating it had been in the water for quite some time. Forensic specialists suggested the wetsuit had been submerged since January 26th, the day after the described events. It's possible that, under the scorching sun and heat, combined with a lack of water, Eileen began experiencing delirium, causing her to remove her suit, which would have compromised her ability to stay afloat. Later, diving weights and oxygen tanks were found, some still containing air. However, none of the discovered items provided evidence of death caused by marine predators. What was clear was that the couple didn't have enough time for anyone to find them alive. On February 14th, the search for the missing couple was officially called off. 3 weeks is more than enough time for human bodies to be entirely consumed by the open ocean. According to all biological and anatomical principles, the Lonergans couldn't have survived unless they had been picked up by another boat. But if that were the case, they would have made contact. The last message. 6 months later, a diving slate belonging to the couple was found 160 miles from where the tourists had disappeared. This specialized slate is used for underwater communication and note-taking. Thanks to it, we now know how long Thomas and Eileen remained alive. On one side of the slate, the message read, Monday, January 26, 1998, 8 a.m. To anyone who can help us, we were left behind at Agincourt Reef on January 25, 1998 at 3 p.m. Please help us. Send assistance before we die. SOS! The couple realized they were on the verge of death and used every possible means to save themselves, even the smallest chance. On October 10, 1998, police officer Noel Noonan made an official statement. Authorities believed that the missing man and woman likely passed away between 8 a.m. on January 26th and February 2nd. Most likely, their death resulted from dehydration or drowning. After being exposed to the hot sun for an extended period without water, they became exhausted and disoriented. The divers voluntarily shed their heavy gear, which had been keeping them afloat. One thing was clear in this situation. They were unlikely to have been eaten. The couple's family members were devastated by the loss. Their deaths seemed senseless and avoidable. Thomas and Eileen were young, with their whole lives ahead of them. But the crew's negligence proved fatal. A professional company, which had maintained a good reputation for years, failed to follow basic safety protocols. Justice. When it came time to face justice, Jeffrey Nairn, captain of the Outer Edge, stood trial for manslaughter. He was responsible for ensuring safety on board. The defendant swore that he had instructed one of the crew members to perform a head count after the final dive, but the crew member made an unforgivable mistake. Allegedly, 2 tourists were counted twice because they had gone for a swim after surfacing. Thanks to the defense's efforts, the Australian Supreme Court acquitted the boat captain in 1999. The defense attorney presented entries from the couple's diaries, which suggested they had grown weary of life, having seen and experienced everything, and wanted to depart voluntarily while they were still young. The relatives of the missing couple argued that Thomas had likely been in a depressed state when he wrote those entries, but that didn't mean he would have taken such a drastic step. Moreover, the couple would never have put others at risk of legal trouble. They were members of the Peace Corps, known for their compassion and sense of responsibility. It was also revealed that Thomas's words had been taken out of context, but the case was not reopened on those grounds. As for the diving company, it suffered an inevitable collapse. Its reputation could not be restored. Following the court's ruling, a massive fine was imposed on the company. The financial burden was too great, and the management declared bankruptcy. Was this justice? One way or another, the beautiful couple could never be brought back. They had been left to face a horrific death in open waters. To this day, their bodies have not been found. Version 1. Perhaps the court's verdict was influenced by the speculation surrounding the missing couple. By the end of 1998, unexpected theories about what had happened began to surface in the media. It started to seem as if the tragic story had a secret motive, or perhaps the press was simply trying to create that illusion. One of the most popular theories was that it was a voluntary departure from life. The idea was that one spouse deprived the other of life, and then ended his own. This theory was seemingly supported by the personal diaries of the Lonergans. The claim was that their deaths were not due to negligence but were part of a carefully planned act by Thomas and Eileen. In support of this, personal writings were cited. 6 months before the event, Thomas wrote, "Like a student who has passed an exam, I think my life is wonderful and I'm ready to die. From what I can tell, my life can only go downhill from here. I've reached my peak and everything is going down." Eileen's thoughts were no less alarming. It was believed that she knew of her husband's desires and was willing to share them. A few weeks before the underwater excursion to the Great Barrier Reef, she wrote, "Tom wants to die a sharp and clear death, and he wants it to happen soon. He's not prone to ending his own life, but he has the desire to die, and I can support him in that." The theory suggests that the couple may have chosen this unusual method because both loved diving. There was something almost mystical about the idea of dying in a place where coral reefs were slowly dying as well. However, the couple's relatives didn't agree with this version. They were convinced that Thomas and Eileen wanted to live, which is why they had planned a vacation after their long mission. In addition, they had recently talked about having children. While they hadn't rushed into parenthood before, they had come to the realization that life would be more joyful with a child. They wanted to continue their family line and pass down their knowledge. It also came to light that journalists had used the couple's diary entries without regard for context, presenting speculation as fact. The spouse's words were twisted and misinterpreted. Version 2. Others believe that the Lonergans' deaths were staged. American researchers Hugh Merchan and Audrey Lindock, who investigated the case, supported this theory. They believed that Thomas and Eileen intended for their diary entries to be found and published. After all, how else would they have ended up in the media? It was revealed that the couple had financial problems that could have resulted in long prison sentences. The theory is that the couple never intended to return home after their trip, choosing instead to escape punishment. It is possible they were picked up by another boat, which had been hired for this purpose. Additionally, there were reports from people claiming to have seen the missing couple. Given the story's notoriety, their faces were recognizable to many. Over the years, police received multiple reports from eyewitnesses who said they had seen the Lonergans alive and well. However, after investigation, these reports turned out to be false. Some were not taken seriously at all. It was also established that since their disappearance, the couple's bank accounts had remained untouched, despite containing substantial sums of money. Sad conclusion. Officially, Thomas and Eileen are still considered missing. Their story served as the basis for the film Open Water, made in 2003 by a married couple who spent about $120,000 bringing the real-life events to the screen. The film helps viewers understand what the couple may have felt in such a dire situation. Each viewer can put themselves in their shoes and feel the helplessness that a person experiences when faced with the elements and predatory animals. The film touches on human negligence in many ways. Even in the final scenes, when fishermen find a scuba camera inside a shark's stomach belonging to the couple, the focus is on their indifference. One of them says, "I wonder if this thing works." yet no one questions how it got there or what happened to its owner. Just as the crew of the Outer Edge had been careless with their duties, failing to notice the couple's personal belongings left behind. If everyone had done their job properly, the tragedy could have been avoided. Despite the different theories, it's most likely that Thomas and Eileen met their end. They were doomed to a slow and agonizing death. The only positive outcome of this entire situation was the tightening of safety measures in diving operations and the mandatory name-by-name headcount of divers on boats. Terrible consequences, a monstrous lesson. Another mysterious story took us to Namyangju City in South Korea. On June 6, 2006, 29-year-old student Lee Yoon-hee disappeared without a trace. It would seem that nothing is unusual. People often disappear. However, this case is still stirring the minds of the public. Many people to this day continue to argue and put forward their own versions of what happened. Disappearance. For the first time about the fact that the girl disappeared spoke on June 7th. The alarm was raised by her friends and classmates. Lee did not come to the university for the last classes, which was very unlike her. She was a responsible and efficient student and had never missed a class before. After studying, Lee's friend Min wanted to check on her and went to her house. However, after ringing the doorbell, no one opened the door. Then she didn't bother and left. Later in an interview, the girl admitted that she decided that Yoon-hee wanted to be alone and had a day off. It so happened that her acquaintance had been haunted by a series of troubles lately. Therefore, it was possible that she needed time to get away. However, on June 8th, she didn't show up again. This time, Min went with Kim, Lee's friend, and 2 other guys to the missing person's house. There was no other way to contact her. It so happened that a week before the described events, the main character's purse was stolen, and together with her purse, Idaho card, and cell phone. When young people knocked on the door, the dog reacted to the noise from inside. The dog barked loudly, but there was no response from the owner. Since Yoon-hee's door had a digital lock, only someone who knew the code could open it. No one present had such information, so Min called the older sister of the wanted woman. But unfortunately, she hadn't heard from her sister and didn't know the code to the door. All this only added to the excitement. Eventually, it was decided to contact the police. Law enforcement officers contacted the owner of the apartment and asked him to come to open the door. Upon entering the student's residence, everyone immediately smelled a foul odor. Life story. Lee Yoon-hee was a pretty and colorful girl. She originally studied fine arts and statistics at a women's university in Seoul. However, after graduation, she realized that she had chosen the wrong path. Since childhood, the protagonist loved animals, and even as an adult has 2 dogs for which she took care of with pleasure. Along with the craving for art, she liked to watch documentaries about nature, visit zoos, farms, and animal shelters. Therefore, having received a diploma, she was not afraid to start from the beginning and finally decided. At the age of 25, the girl decided to connect life with veterinary medicine. Parents did not immediately support their daughter. The traditional family believed that at such an age, it was time for her to get married and have children. However, Lee was a modern girl, so she wanted to build a career for a start. Therefore, in 2003, she entered the higher school of veterinary medicine. The new specialty liked the student and was given easily. At the same time, in order to be independent, she began to work part-time. Lately, the girl has been tutoring younger students, as well as children of teachers. In 2006, when the study was coming to an end, Lee was preparing for final exams. It is understandable that trying to combine study and work, she was very tired. But circumstances demanded it. A robbery. On June 2nd, Lee was returning home after a private class. She was walking at a slow pace, absorbed in her thoughts. Suddenly, 2 men on a motorcycle sped past her at breakneck speed. As she recovered from her fright, the student realized that the intruders had stolen her purse. Several witnesses to the incident tried to help and went after them. Their van managed to chase the motorcycle for a while. However, once the thieves turned down a narrow alley, The chase had to be called off. The culprits were not punished, and Yoon-hee was left without her important belongings. After that, she warned everyone she knew that she would be out of touch for a while. The girl was so upset that she told her friend, "I can't believe the world can be such a horrible place." However, at that moment, she didn't know even half of what she was going to experience. The situation at Lee's apartment. Lee's apartment was empty. What was noticeable was the mess made by the dogs. 2 puppies were lying on the floor. In the absence of water and food, they were dehydrated. Apparently, the animals were trying to find something to eat. Therefore, scraps of papers and clothes were lying everywhere. It became clear that the pets had not been walked for several days, hence the pungent odor that filled the room. Min noticed her friend's conspicuous backpack standing quietly in the corner of the room. Since it contained the essentials, Yoon-hee never went anywhere without it. This indicated that she left the apartment in a hurry or for a short time. The condition of the house did not seem suspicious to the police. At first glance, nothing was missing, and there were no signs of forced entry. Therefore, assuming that the wanted girl had left voluntarily and would return soon, the police left. However, such arguments did not satisfy her friends. First, Lee would never in the world would not have left the animals to starve. Secondly, she could not disappear without telling anyone. So the company contacted Lee's family members. The family confirmed that they hadn't heard from her in days. Dissatisfied with the police officer's conclusion, Min and her friend went to the station. Unfortunately, due to the slowness and poor handling of the investigation, Korean law enforcement agencies have been repeatedly admonished for their actions. So the young people decided to insist on their own and officially report their friend missing. Evidence. At this time, 2 of Lee's other friends stayed at the house. They wanted to wait for her parents and discuss everything. Not wanting to embarrass the missing person's relatives, the guys decided to clean up the apartment. They washed the floors, threw out the trash, and even washed dirty laundry. In general, destroyed all the evidence that had taken place. In addition, it was later learned that upon arrival, Lee's sister threw away the cigarette butt found on the veranda. She did so because she didn't want to embarrass her sister in front of her parents. They would be very upset to know that their daughter smokes. But the thing is, Yoon-hee's acquaintances unanimously claimed that they had never seen it. Perhaps in this way, another solid piece of evidence in the case was destroyed. Afterward, the guys were very sorry that wanting to do better only aggravated the situation. The young people explained that at that time the police had not taken up the investigation and had not warned them not to touch anything. When Lee's parents arrived in the evening, they inspected the apartment. Dong, the girl's father, reported that several other things were missing along with his daughter. The first thing he named was a hammer. The man explained that he personally insisted that such a necessary item was in the house. Lee Yoon-hee had always laughed about it and kept it in plain sight. The other missing item was an antique coffee table. The student was particularly fond of it, often eating at it and using it as a bedside table. It was unclear to everyone where the girl could have gone, as well as where 2 unrelated objects had disappeared to. The unknown painted a frightening picture. The last party. That day, in addition to the police report from Lee's friends, there was another one. The concerned parents of the missing girl decided not to delay. It was already obvious that enough time had passed since the alleged disappearance. She was last seen on June 5th. That was when Yoon-hee and her classmates finished their last practice of the semester. The young people were going to celebrate the significant event. For this purpose, they even invited the teachers. Obviously, not everyone agreed, but some still decided to keep company with a group of 40 students. The protagonist was upset that she had suffered another failure because of an unsuccessful, in her opinion, operation on an animal. Due to this, she had no desire to go to the party. Some even claimed that she locked herself in the restroom and cried. Perhaps before graduation, the diligent student simply lost her nerve. Therefore, she was so critical of herself and saw the world in pessimistic colors. Nevertheless, her friends managed to calm the girl down and persuade her to join the party at the karaoke bar. By 10 o'clock in the evening, Lee's mood had noticeably improved. Everyone gathered in the pub. They ate, drank, remembered university everyday life, danced and sang songs. They were supported by the heroine of the story. CCTV cameras recorded how at around 2:30 at night she left the toilet and left the celebration. It was noticeable that the girl was upset about something. However, the rapid departure was noticed by a 27-year-old guy named Kim and went after her. According to the man, he asked what happened. Since young people were close since their school years, Lee confessed and complained to her friend that someone was watching her in the toilet. However, she did not give any details. Kim was concerned for his friend. He knew that she was already frightened by the recent attack on the street, so he offered to carry her backpack and escort her home. Lee lived in a rented apartment about a 20-minute walk away. Kim later told investigators that he was unable to walk his buddy to the door. She said goodbye to him in one of the dark alleys. However, the young man still decided to wait until the lights came on in the windows of her house. After making sure that the girl was not threatened, he turned around and went to his house. It should be noted that the guy lived nearby. On June 6th, the country celebrated a national holiday, Memorial Day. Therefore, the absence of news from her did not seem strange to anyone. However, it was after the party that no one saw Yoon-hee. The beginning of the investigation. During the investigation, curious facts were established. On the morning of June 5th, about 4 o'clock the day before the disappearance, one of the classmates came to see Lee. He said that he was fixing a loose leg of the coffee table. He told the investigation that Lee did not want to throw it away, so she asked him to fix it. He stayed in the apartment for about half an hour, he said. After the short repair, the couple went to the university. He was not present during the celebration and never met Lee again. Some claim that the young people were in a romantic relationship, but there is no concrete evidence of this. In parallel, the relatives of the missing woman conducted their own search. One day, Lee's father, Dong, in search of any clues, explored the neighborhood where his daughter lived. Suddenly, between two garbage cans, the man noticed a familiar table. However, the tabletop and the unscrewed metal legs were lying separately. The relatives assumed that it was damaged during the events that took place in the apartment. The find was submitted for examination. It is quite possible that on the ill-fated night, Lee was the victim of a brutal attack. Her father was worried that she could have been killed because of the hammer he had given her. It is possible that the perpetrator, having gotten rid of the table, took the tool with him or hid it somewhere. Stalker theory. Amazingly, during the inspection of Lee Yoon-hee's home, the experts were unable to find any fingerprints, DNA, blood, or any other evidence. So thoroughly had Lee's friends cleaned the apartment. Therefore, the police decided to resort to searching for eyewitnesses. Since the walls of the apartment building were quite thin, someone could surely hear something. However, none of the girls' neighbors reported anything unusual. Many of the residents refused to engage in any conversation at all. At the same time, one elderly woman said that a few days before Lee's disappearance, she herself had been harassed. Someone, presumably a man, followed her to her front door and then stopped. The woman decided that opening the door would give a chance for an attack, so she turned sharply and came face to face with the stalker. She noted that the hood made it difficult to see his face. However, her actions frightened the unknown man. He turned around and left. It should be noted that in South Korea, pushing has become widespread. This term means unwanted, intrusive attention to one person by another or a group of people. Very often, law enforcement officers record reports of women who report repeated incidents. It is not uncommon for a stalker to stand at the door and wait before leaving. This further creates feelings of anxiety and fear. Often, sexual offenses are triggered by stalking. Therefore, on October 20th, 2022, a law came into effect that made stalking a crime. The sanction of the article provides for imprisonment for up to 3 years. Previously, it was qualified as a misdemeanor and punishable by a fine of $70. Some believe that a similar situation could have happened to our heroine. However, her case could end tragically. Later, this version found confirmation. In the house across the street, there is an apartment from which there is a clear view of Lee's windows. Whoever lived there could unobstructedly observe her actions. During the investigation, it turned out that the premises had been empty for a long time. However, an inspection revealed several empty cigarette packs and used tissues. Unfortunately, the DNA extracted was not suitable for examination. Nevertheless, it indicated that someone had visited the apartment periodically and stood at the window. The investigation is ongoing. Detectives interviewed all the party participants. Unfortunately, none of them knew what had happened to the girl during the celebration, much less after it, except perhaps Kim, who escorted her friend to the alley and waited until she went home. The sincerity of 21 people was tested on a lie detector. All of the subjects passed, but it is still worth noting that this method is not always reliable. However, the polygraph has been used in the country since 1950 and is trustworthy. In addition, task forces with search dogs searched the entire city, as well as the nearest mountains. Volunteers put up tens of thousands of flyers asking for any information. Later, Lee's parents sold all their property and offered 10 million won for information about their daughter's whereabouts. However, all was in vain. A new lead. The missing girl's family and acquaintances wanted to believe that she would return alive. Perhaps because of the stress of her experience, Yoon-hee decided to disappear for a while, forgetting her responsibilities to her parents and the pets she left at home. Maybe she's the one who threw away her favorite but broken table and her unwanted hammer. And there would be an innocent explanation for the dried napkins in the apartment across the street. But that last hope vanished as soon as the cybercrime experts got involved. They scrutinized Lee's computer and recovered the deleted files. Some gruesome details emerged. On June 6th at 2:59 a.m., about the same time the girl was supposed to return home, someone gained access to her desktop. He opened Naver, an internet portal used by 70% of the country's residents. He then typed the following phrases into the search: sexual harassment, contact the police, and 112. The work session ended at 3:02 a.m. The computer itself was manually shut down at 4:21 a.m. Specialists assumed that the missing student came home and sat down at the computer. Based on searches, she was sexually harassed at a party or on her way home. And since she didn't have a phone, she looked for a way to report it online. However, after 3 minutes, her actions were interrupted by someone. Experts also found out that on June 8th, between 3:15 in the afternoon and 5:21 in the afternoon, someone turned on the girl's computer again. At the same time, the unknown person deleted the history of messages in the messenger from 10:48 p.m. on June 4th until 3:04 a.m. on June 8th. To do this, he used a special program known in narrow circles. After it, it is not possible to restore the chat history. At the same time, it shows that a person who is well-versed in computers acted. 2 days later, someone again logged into Lee's account on a popular music site and even checked his email. Using the IP address, police were able to trace the location of the connection. It was a motel in the town of Kunsan, which is 119 miles away. After reviewing the CCTV cameras from that day, detectives found no signs of suspicious behavior or traces of the missing student. However, this fact indicated that she did not disappear of her own accord. Someone was skillfully cleaning up the traces of the crime that had been committed. The first person who comes to mind is Kim, who by a strange coincidence was at Lee's house at the time of the mass deletion of correspondence. If you remember, he stayed with a friend to wait for Yoon-hee's family to arrive and did some cleaning. This gave him the perfect opportunity and enough time to cover up the unwanted actions. Amazingly, when investigators asked the boys if they had turned on Lee's computer, both said they didn't remember. In fact, there were no witnesses, no traces, and no significant leads in the case of Lee Yoon-hee's disappearance. Possible evidence was destroyed during the cleaning and clearing of the chat history. Had the girl's body been found, it is almost certain that the perpetrator would have been caught. For the most part, the victim keeps key evidence of the crime. To this day, however, the student's whereabouts remain unknown. as does her condition. She is most likely dead, and her remains are safely hidden or managed to get rid of them forever. These circumstances lead to another version of what happened: a mad professor. It is known that the faculty where Lee studied collected animal carcasses. This was done so that students were engaged in autopsy and study. At the end of the study, the remains were collected and sent by the agency to a special incinerator. Before this, the biomass was packed in specialized bags. According to the company's rules, the collectors were not allowed to look into them. It should be noted that the sight is unpleasant, so they would not do it themselves. Approximately 88 pounds of animal remains are placed in the incinerator daily. However, investigators learned that 2 days after Yoon-hee's disappearance, about 242 pounds were incinerated. In other words, much more than usual. The educational institution worked on different animals: dogs, cats, pigs, and cows. However, according to the records of June 8th, there were no large animals. The dilemma arises: what else was burned that day? Could the extra weight have belonged to the missing student's body as well as other evidence? Unfortunately, this question remains unanswered. It was not possible to conduct a genetic examination, as all the ashes were destroyed. Assuming that Lee's body was indeed burned, it means that it was done by someone who killed her and had access to the room. For example, one of the faculty members, Professor Moon, was of great interest, the same man whose children Lee was studying with when her purse was stolen. During the interrogations, several people reported that Moon sometimes showed attention to a beautiful student. He openly flirted with her, unashamed of his status and age. The man was also present during the celebrations at that party and tried to sit next to Lee, but she moved away from him, calling him a creep. It was obvious that she was not accepting his advances. Initially, Moon said he left the event early and was home around 2 a.m. Then, when other detectives noticed that he had left after Lee, he changed his statement. It is quite possible that the professor molested her and then stalked her. Afraid of ruining his reputation, he may have silenced Yoon-hee. It's possible that he followed her that night, then broke into her apartment and killed her. Then he moved the body to the crematorium. He could also have taken the student to the campus by force and burned her alive. Either way, there's a lot of speculation. On the one hand, a stranger obsessed with Lee. He could have stolen her purse to get his hands on the object of his adoration and watched from the apartment across the street before or after the event. It is possible that it was he who attacked, kidnapped, or killed the poor girl. On the other hand, there are a lot of questions about her buddy Kim. Dong stated that there was a suspect they were sure of and pointed him out. There's no video footage of the young men walking home together after the party. Also, no one present saw Lee and Kim leave. It's hard to believe that the girl didn't want to be escorted all the way to the door and said goodbye in an alley at night. Everyone knows that the guy has been in love with her since high school. There is an opinion that he even went to university because of her. At the same time, Lee sincerely trusted him and loved him in her own way, accepted his gifts, spent time with him. However, Lee's feelings were not what he would have wanted. Many joked that Kim became her third puppy. Later, one important detail came to light. It turns out that the young man knew the code from the door of the beloved. In her absence, he repeatedly came to the apartment, looked after the dogs. However, he did not tell about it, so as not to defame the girl in the eyes of others. By our standards, South Korea is still a rather strict country. At the same time, it looks suspicious. His motive could have been simple jealousy. He could have snapped when he found out Lee had a boyfriend. He may have secretly followed her and then went up to her apartment. There was an argument during which Kim broke the coffee table and took his girlfriend's life. He then decided to stay behind to clean up the crime scene. At the same time, no charges were brought against him. Moreover, in an interview, the lead detective hinted that he didn't think the guy was involved in the crime. And despite popular belief, the most likely suspect is Professor Moon. The man could have used his official position to lure a student he liked into the lab and do something terrible to her. As of 2017, Kim was married, had children, and his own business. Lee's father still accused him of being involved in his daughter's disappearance. He even organized several demonstrations outside the man's private clinic. To defend his honor, Jim was forced to file a defamation lawsuit. With the court's decision, Dong was banned from approaching Kim's building. To this day, the man claims that many media outlets have defamed his name. 18 years have passed, but the search for Lee still continues. In time, her photos and age image were made public. The missing person's parents have grown old. But before leaving this world, they want to calm down and know for sure whether their daughter is alive or not. Over time, any pain is dulled, even from the loss of a loved one. But there's nothing worse than being left in the dark for years. What do you guys think? Is Lee Yoon-hee alive? And if not, who really killed her? Did you know that along with criminology, the science of crime, there is also victimology? This is a field of study that is at the intersection of criminology, psychology, and sociology, and deals with the study of crime victims. It turns out that there are certain predispositions of people to have a crime committed against them. These factors include social status, life experiences, and, of course, psychological characteristics. The worse the social conditions of life, the higher the risk of becoming a victim. At the same time, the higher the social status, the greater the chances of encountering fraud, extortion, and kidnapping. As far as personal experience is concerned, it is simple. People who know how to deal with their surroundings, circumstances are safer, unlike others. Personality traits are probably the defining condition in this list. What kind of character a person possesses determines his or her life position and, consequently, victimization. The case that happened in 1995 in New York is about sacrifice and openness to the world, which became fatal for 21-year-old Kimberly Antonakos. The heroine of today's story is a beautiful girl with a good heart who could not have imagined even in a terrible dream what horror life has prepared her. Thomas Antonakos, a successful businessman and a wonderful father, learned about the disappearance of his daughter from her colleagues. The girl's co-workers contacted him when Kimberly failed to show up for work on the first spring day. She was very punctual and was in good standing with management, so her absence was considered a bad sign, and they were right. The assumption that the employee was ill was dispelled. The worried father also said that he had not been able to call Kim since last night and had a premonition of trouble. His girl was always in touch because he made her a rare and expensive gift for those times, a cell phone. But she didn't answer the phone, so the man was forced to contact her friends. However, they did not help him. No one has seen Kimberly since she left the party in the early morning hours of March 1st. The grieving father decided not to wait and went to the police. Only after learning that the young woman was wanted, law enforcement officials suggested waiting at least 24 hours. It is quite possible that she spent the night at someone's house and will soon make herself known. She was already an adult and could do what she wanted. This attitude to the case did not satisfy Thomas, so he organized his own investigation. Remarkably, but the light on the story of Kimberly's disappearance was shed by a psychic. A person with supernatural abilities was approached by the girl's mother. The woman flew from Florida as soon as she learned about what had happened. In despair, on the advice of a friend, she decided to use all possibilities. Psychic at the sight of the photo of Kim reported that she is still alive, but very weak and dehydrated. She also said that the girl was kidnapped by acquaintances and tried to escape more than once. Finally, she added that the deadly danger comes from several people, and the name of one of them begins with the letter J. Apparently, this is the ringleader of the gang. This information was later made public and caused not only a public outcry, but also unavoidable consequences. However, let's start at the beginning. Kimberly was born in 1974 in New York, USA. She was the only child in the family. Despite the fact that the girl grew up in love and affluence, she was not pampered. Her parents came from simple families. Nevertheless, her father Thomas managed to achieve considerable heights. He created his own company, which was engaged in computers. Earned funds, the man was happy to spend on his favorite daughter and her desires. When Kim was a little girl, the couple Antonakos divorced. The child was left to live with his mother. However,
This did not weaken the connection between the little girl and her father. He took her on weekends and spent all his free time with her. When Kimberly's mother found a new man and decided to move to Florida, the girl faced a choice: to stay with her mother or with her father. Since she did not want to move, and with her dad felt as wonderful as with her mom, the young lady preferred to live in familiar conditions. So Kim began living with her father, with whom she was very close. She grew up a well-mannered and sociable child. Over the years, she became a bright beauty. Her dazzling smile always lifted her spirits, and in general, she was distinguished by a sense of humor and positivity. Since childhood, she was surrounded by care, protected from trouble. Therefore, Kimberly saw only good in all people. Immediate problems bypassed her, in connection with which she was only heard about the dark side of life. Unfortunately, an open and kind soul brings a lot of sorrows to its owner. In 1994, the girl became a student at the College of Staten Island. A little later, she informed her father that she felt old enough to live independently. Undoubtedly, Mr. Antonikos was concerned about her decision, but respected it and decided not to oppose it. Then he promised himself to secure her separate living arrangements as much as possible. Therefore, Thomas purchased a nice apartment for his daughter in an affluent area of the city. He even equipped his daughter's dwelling with an alarm system. Not wanting her to park far from home, the man bought a space in the garage across the street. And to keep her in constant communication, she had a cell phone and a pager. Everything that was up to the father, he did to the highest standard. His concern for Kim's safety had good reason. It had to do with his affluence and the girl's little worldly experience. Kimberly not only did well in school, but also worked part-time. She refused her father's offer to continue the family business because she wanted to find her own way. So Kimberly took a part-time job as an accountant at a successful firm. At this time, she lived an ordinary student life, often entertained, attended parties. Her father repeatedly offered to return, but she refused. Her desire to be independent led to an unexpected denouement. In early 1995, Kimberly sheltered in her home friend Liz Pace and her family. Their apartment was being renovated. Out of the kindness of her heart, Kimberly offered her spacious lodging. The young people had fun. They cooked together and spent evenings together. On one such day, Kimberly and her friend decided to go to a party. The girls put on makeup, did their hair, and picked out suitable outfits, after which they went to the party. According to Liz, they had a good time. They had fun and danced. Afterwards, Kimberly drove them home in her white 1994 Honda Accord. However, she did not go up to the apartment, citing unfinished business. The girls embraced and never saw each other again. The first place Mr. Antonakos went to after the police was the parking lot next to his daughter's house. However, the car was missing from the garage. On the floor near the wall, the man noticed a shiny object. It turned out to be a small gold earring. The father remembered that he had given his daughter similar ones, and just in case he took them with him. Kimberly wasn't in the apartment either. He only came across guests, a friend, her boyfriend Joshua Torres, and their joint 2-year-old child. Thomas was aware of the decision, but was not in favor of it. The tenants were also surprised by the absence of the hostess and worried about her. Joshua reported that he was looking for Kimberly and volunteered to help. Later, Thomas came to the police station again. He stated that his daughter had had an accident, but the officers remained adamant. The unhappy father decided to communicate again with Liz, who was the last person to see Kim. The man showed the found jewelry. The girl confirmed that she had seen those earrings on Kim the night of the disappearance. Next, Mr. Antonakos visited the places where his daughter often went. There he talked to many people but did not learn anything important. Joshua, in turn, offered to look not only for Kimberly, but also for the car, which was very conspicuous. Then Thomas went to the police for the third time. This time, he was determined. Therefore, he informed the law enforcement officers that he would not go anywhere until they went on a search. One of the detectives responded to the appeal of the agitated father. He said that despite the protocol, he would take up the investigation. The first thing he did was to reconstruct the events of February 28th. Miss Antonakos went to college in the morning, then to work afterward. After working a few hours, she came home. There, together with friends, she had dinner and then attended a party with Liz. Around 4 a.m., the girls arrived home. After that, Jim went to the parking lot. What urgent business she had at such an early time, it was not possible to find out. In the apartment and garage of the missing was searched, but no evidence or traces indicating a struggle were found. No foreign fingerprints were found either. Either someone made an effort to clean them, or the intruder acted with gloves. The car and driver seemed to have vanished without a trace. The only concern was the earring that was found. The girl's bank account was also analyzed. It was found that the last time she used the bank card was the evening before her disappearance. Therefore, the theory of running away from home was ruled out. The detective's theory was that Kimberly had been kidnapped. At this point, other police officers joined the investigation. For lack of other solid leads, law enforcement unofficially adhered to the information that Mrs. Antonakos received from the psychic. By the way, it is not uncommon for authorities to cooperate with people who have psychic abilities. Sometimes such involvement has positive results, but it is simply not publicized en masse. Witness interviews followed. The first people interviewed were Liz and Joshua. Officers learned that 65 calls had been made from Kimberly's landline on the morning of March 1st. This surprised detectives. However, Joshua explained that he had been calling all of his friends and acquaintances, hoping to figure out where Kim had gone and why she hadn't spent the night at home. According to him, she was like a little sister to him. Thanks to Liz's testimony, it was possible to determine what clothes Kim was wearing. A portrait was drawn up, which was to be published. A distinctive note on the girl's body were tattoos. One of them was in the form of a scorpion, her zodiac sign. The other was located on the waist and represented an infinity sign in the form of two naked people. In parallel, there was a search for the missing car. Were checked all the scrapped metal collection points, as well as other places where the vehicle could be in order to disassemble for parts or sale. However, there was no positive result. A check of the girl's cell phone was also unsuccessful. Police officers told Thomas that he should have paid attention to the letters and phone calls he was receiving, as his daughter's kidnappers could have contacted him and offered a ransom. However, the Antonakos family remained in limbo until March 4th. Around 2 a.m., emergency services received a report of a fire. A large abandoned house was burning at 86 Woodhaven Avenue in Queens. Several fire crews were involved in putting it out. When the fire was finally extinguished, a charred body was found in the basement of the building. Forensic experts found out that the deceased was a woman of 25 years old. On her head survived a part of black long hair. There were also traces of tape. The poor woman's legs were bound and her hands were tied behind her back. However, the worst part of the story was something else. She was alive at the time of the fire, as evidenced by her smoke-filled lungs. In fact, the young woman was burned alive. Detectives hypothesized that the body found belonged to the missing Kimberly. However, dental records were needed for a full identification. At the same time, the ashes were inspected. The smell of gasoline could also be smelled in the air. It was obvious that the house had been set on fire. Apparently, someone had decided to destroy evidence of a serious crime, and indeed, there were no traces except for the charred body. Examining the charred corpse, the specialists also found tattoos matching the description of the missing woman. The records that came from the dental clinic confirmed the suspicions of the investigation. That's how Kimberly Antonakos' body was found. Later, other circumstances of the case became known. One of the eyewitnesses of the fire reported that he often walked with his dog. However, the pet had been behaving strangely in recent days. It was nervous and barked at the house. It was unclear what could have caused this reaction. After the fire and the discovery of the body, it became clear what so attracted the attention of the dog. The girl tried to free herself and called for help. With its acute hearing, the dog heard the sounds coming from the basement while they were inaccessible to human perception. When the officers questioned the owner, it turned out that he had visited the building more than once in recent days. The fact is that he put the house for sale and monitored its condition, and also picked up the mail and receipts. However, the man did not look into the basement, inspecting the house only from the outside. As the homeowner admitted, he never heard the suspicious noise, otherwise he would have paid attention to it. The man was clearly shocked by what happened. The investigators decided to question Joshua again, something they didn't like about the guy. In addition, by a strange coincidence, his name began with the letter J. This time, Joshua talked about the guy he hadn't reached the day Kimberly disappeared. It was a young man nicknamed Psycho, a Russian national who had once dated Kimberly. Detectives decided to verify the information. They determined that the Russian had moved to the United States with his parents as a young child. Having grown up, he became a member of a gang and repeatedly broke the law. So, in the case appeared the first suspect, who was soon detained. During the interrogation, Psycho became aware of the death of a former lover. However, his reaction shocked the detectives. The young man did not just claim that he was not involved in the crime. He was heartbroken. It was clear that he was experiencing genuine emotions. Investigators also wanted to see how he would behave at a crime scene, so they took him to the scene of the tragedy. There, everyone was convinced that they had the wrong man in custody. In addition, after some time, the guy's alibi was confirmed. Once again, the investigation was deadlocked. The victim's family decided to turn to the psychic once again. This time, the psychic said that she saw 4 people involved in the crime. She also said that the kidnappers wanted to establish contact, but they failed to do so. Allegedly, the kidnapping itself did not initially suggest a sad ending. "The denouement is coming soon," the fortune teller summarized. A couple days later, hoping to get some information, the missing woman's father announced a $10,000 reward to anyone who would help catch the culprit. Mr. Antonakos could not forget the words spoken by the clairvoyant. If he had been told earlier that he would rely on some fortune tellers and soothsayers, he would never have believed it. But grief makes a man suggestible. The man went over in his mind her words about her daughter's kidnappers wanting to get in touch. What did that mean, and what prevented them? Then he returned home and sat down at the table. He stared at his phone for a long time as he suddenly remembered a minor point. On the day Kimberly disappeared, he had listened to all the answering machine recordings, as he had been expecting his girl to contact him. However, there had been no voicemails, except perhaps 2 blank ones. When he turned them on, he heard nothing. There was dead silence on the other end of the handset, so he mistook them for some sort of device malfunction or communication problems. However, it later turned out that this was not the case. 5 days after the girl's body was discovered, officers managed to locate her car. It was parked in a fairly quiet area of town, not far from the crime scene. The investigation hoped to find fingerprints in the car. However, the vehicle was well washed. The only evidence was Kimberly's hair and the second earring in the passenger compartment. It seemed like a breakthrough in the investigation, but it did not happen. At the same time, Kimberly's father was being implicated in a local mob hit. Allegedly, such a rich and successful man was clearly connected with the criminal world. Some of the man's entourage even blamed him for the death of his daughter, as if his dark deeds had brought trouble on his daughter. The grief-stricken father denied any involvement. Detectives, through their own channels, managed to verify the information floating around. It was not confirmed. Thomas was clean and conducted his business openly. In July 1995, a young man was arrested by the police in a New York City home for burglary. Unexpectedly, he provided information concerning the case of Miss Antonakos. The detainee claimed that he had heard from an acquaintance that his friends had kidnapped and then burned the girl. When the officers heard the name of the unidentified man, the picture of the crime finally emerged. It was none other than Joshua Torres, the same guy who lived in Kimberly's apartment and helped in the search for her. Detectives decided to take a closer look at him. The young man was called back in for questioning. He denied any involvement in the crime. However, during a long conversation, he gave himself away. Torres said that if he had been the kidnapper, he would have fed Kim. Detectives latched onto that line, because there was no coverage of the victim dying of hunger, thirst, or cold. No one outside the investigation knew that, not even her father. However, they needed more evidence, and it didn't take them long. Officers looked into the identity of the new suspect. It was found that the guy had a criminal record and was repeatedly attracted. In addition, he did not work anywhere and lived at the expense of his roommate Liz. While the girl worked, he took care of the child. Having free time allowed him to plan the crime in peace. He knew Kimberly's routine, could track her down and hide her in an abandoned house. Then why didn't he demand a ransom? Something must have gone wrong, so the unsub got rid of Kim. The calls Torres made that morning were analyzed. It became obvious that the guy was lying when he said he was calling Kimberly's contacts. Most of the numbers belonged to random people with no connection to Kimberly. After examining his pager data, it was discovered that the guy had sent some strange messages on March 1st. The ring around Joshua was gradually closing. He had been suspicious to detectives for a long time. Finally, they got solid leads to apprehend him. They admitted to him that they no longer considered Kimberly's ex-boyfriend a suspect. And once again, they pressed the case intelligently. That's when Torres said he suspected his friends of massacring the girl. He pleaded guilty to accessory to kidnapping. At the same time, he said that he did not think that his comrades would eventually decide to get rid of a common friend. According to him, they just wanted to get the ransom and then let the victim go. But the plan didn't work. The kidnappers wondered why their calls went ignored by Mr. Antonikos. It turns out that they did make contact with Kimberly's father and even recorded a message to ransom her. However, the recording of the conversation was not saved on the answering machine for some reason. The kidnappers were angered by the father's inaction and decided to wait for further developments in the case. It turns out that they were frightened not only by the publicity, but also by the words of the clairvoyant that the suspect's name begins with the letter J. This information was not only published in the media, but also broadcast on TV with reference to an additional unofficial source of information. It's a mystical, vicious circle. One action spawned another. After speaking with the police, Joshua was released on bail and then disappeared. At the same time, his accomplice Jose was shot in the back of the head while walking with his wife. His wife later admitted to investigators that her husband did not trust Joshua, used a tape recorder when talking to him, and wanted to expose him. She claimed he felt guilty about kidnapping Kimberly, but he didn't set the house on fire, and soon wanted to confess everything to the police as he had confessed to her. Thanks to the pager messages and the suspect's statements, investigators established the details of the kidnapping and the crime. Thus it was found that 4 men were involved: Joshua Torres, Julio Negron, Jose Negron, Julio's namesake, and Nicholas Brett, nicknamed Jay. Notably, Julio dated Kimberly for a while and even wanted to marry her, but she rejected his proposal. The young people were united by the fact that they were friends and had a criminal past behind them. However, it did not compare to what the guys did to the poor girl. Nicholas had been released on bail shortly before the kidnapping. Thanks to his mother, he got off with a small fine for a crime that could have sentenced him to more than a year in prison. As for Joshua, at a young age, he was involved in cases of child abduction, violence against a minor, illegal carrying of weapons. However, he too was limited to a light sentence for the acts committed. The initiator of the crime was undoubtedly him. It was Joshua who coordinated the group's actions. After Kimberly returned from the party, the men grabbed her in the parking lot. Apparently, they'd been following her and waiting for the perfect moment to leave her alone. A gun was used for intimidation. Kim resisted, so her hands were tied and her mouth, eyes, and even ears were covered with duct tape. After that, the bandits put the girl in the trunk and drove her to an abandoned house. There, they took the unfortunate woman to the basement and tied her to a chair. They even removed her shoes so that she would not attract attention to herself by tapping her feet. Before this, the young men told Kimberly that her father owed money and they would release her after he had paid them. Julio was supposed to look after the girl, bring her food and water twice a day, and make sure she was warm. However, he was afraid of the consequences and left the house. As it happened, the victim did not eat or drink for 3 days, and also froze from the cold. As soon as the abductee was left alone, the perpetrators informed Joshua. He made an audio recording in which he demanded $75,000 as ransom. Then the guy called the girl's father and left 2 messages, which later turned out to be empty, so they were not taken into account by Mr. Antimachos. The kidnappers waited for news and sincerely did not understand why Kim's father did not get in touch with them. During this time, Kimberly, left unattended, passed out from dehydration more than once.
but she was still fighting for life. The intruders were angry that they had not received the ransom, and they were afraid of being caught, so they decided to let her go. When they went down to the basement, they found the girl unconscious. Deciding that Kimberly was dead, they thought of nothing better than to get rid of all the evidence, and at the same time of the hostage. In talking to Liz, the officers discovered that Joshua had used his roommate as an alibi. He directed the actions of the accomplices while in the house with the child. Liz claimed that at first she did not even realize that her boyfriend had kidnapped Kimberly. Later at trial, Liz testified against him. She said that after the interrogation, Joshua came to her and confessed to everything. After that, he beat her and silenced her, threatened to kill her, and soon went on the run. Sometime later, the perpetrator was arrested. He was also suspected of killing Jose, however, there was no direct evidence of this. Investigators decided to confront the former friends. They informed them that Joshua denied his involvement in the massacre. When Julio learned about it, he cooperated with the investigation and told everything. This allowed Torres to be convicted of Kimberly's murder. As a result, the trio was charged with murder, arson, kidnapping, and holding a person against his will. During the trial, it was found that Joshua had repeatedly tried to mislead the investigation and avoid punishment. The jury deliberated for about 10 hours. In the end, Joshua Torres was sentenced to 58 years in prison. Nicholas Brett received the same sentence. Julio Negron was only found guilty of accessory after the fact. As such, he was sentenced to between 2 and 6 years in prison. Tomas Antonakos was satisfied with the verdict of the court. He did not want the criminals to be sentenced to death. In his opinion, it would have been the lightest punishment. It is known that Nicholas was repeatedly abused and assaulted in prison. And after 2 years in prison, he died of AIDS. Julio was released after 2 years, having served his sentence. Joshua will not be released until 2053 at the earliest, if he lives to see it. Sadly, in 2005, the victim's father died of cancer. His family is sure that the disease provoked the terrible death of his daughter. This is how unexpectedly cut short the life of a beautiful girl, Kimberly Antonakos. Whether excessive good-naturedness the cause of her premature departure, it is difficult to judge. However, if she had been more prudent and choosy in her surroundings, perhaps she would have lived a long and happy life. Good always triumphs over evil, even in a case like this. The trial that took place and life afterward set things right. The perpetrators of the tragedy are severely punished and are unlikely to ever forget what they have done. Wake up. Is anyone alive in this house? Judy cheerfully entered the home of her sister, Linda Slayton. The morning of September 4th was normal, but something seemed off. Judy often visited her nephews, and today she came to their home as usual. A cup of hot coffee and a friendly conversation with her sister was how their day usually began. "Where are you, little slackers?" Judy smiled, peering into the room of her nephews, who were sleepily rubbing their eyes. She was surprised to see Linda still asleep, for she usually woke up before the boys left for school. Judy left the house and noticed that the window in her sister's room was wide open and one of the curtains was missing. It was strange. "Why aren't you in school yet? Is your mom sick? Why is she still sleeping?" Judy walked restlessly toward her sister's bedroom. "Linda Slayton, I want to see you." Judy knocked on the door, but there was no answer. The next instant, the sight that came into view made her heart sink. Her sister's body lay across the bed, her head hanging to the floor. The young woman was half undressed, and a wire hanger was wrapped around her neck. There was no sign of a struggle in the room. The closet was open, but otherwise, everything looked normal, Linda's things lying in their places. Upon seeing her sister's body, Judy screamed, and the janitor working outside called the police. The police arrived and asked the children to leave the house, which had now become a crime scene. Jeff was able to walk past his mother's room without looking at her body. Tim, on the other hand, looked into the room and saw his mother dead. The boys were sent to their grandparents' house for the duration of the investigation. That fateful morning was the beginning of a mysterious and dark story. It changed their lives forever. Linda Slayton was born on a spring day, March 8, 1950. The girl dreamed of a large and happy family. Her fate, however, did not turn out the way she wanted. At the age of 19, Linda entered into marriage with Frank Slayton. At this age, she was already a mother. 3 years before the wedding, the couple had their first son, Jeffrey, and after another year, a younger son, Timothy, was born. And only after another year, Linda managed to convince the father of their children, Frank, to become a family. But, alas, this marriage turned out to be far from her expectations. Frank, after becoming a husband and father, disappointed his family. He turned out to be a cruel man. His outbursts of anger regularly fell on his wife and sons. Jeff and Tim's memories of their childhood were filled with nightmares. Their father was an aggressive alcoholic who kept his family in suspense. Linda often thought about divorce, but fear and addiction prevented her from taking that step. However, in 1974, after 9 long years of marriage, she gathered the last vestiges of strength and determination. Leaving behind the hell that was their family, Linda took her sons and left Frank Slayton. It was the first step towards a new life where Linda hoped she could give her sons the security and happiness they had been denied for so long. She didn't yet know the trials that lay ahead, including that terrible day that became fateful for her family. After the divorce, Linda and her 2 children lived at 303 North Brunel Parkway in Lakeland, Florida, which was one of Polk County's densely populated cities. In 1981, it was a place where business was booming, and new residential neighborhoods were being built on every corner. These were mostly duplexes where large families settled. Lakeland, with its abundance of lawns and greenery, was very attractive to residents. One of the many duplex homes belonged to the Slayton family. Despite this, they didn't stay in it for long. It is known that Linda and her sons moved to Florida from Hartselle, Alabama, just 2 weeks before the horrific crime. What could have led to such a gruesome tragedy? Perhaps Linda brought not only her children with her, but also dark issues from her past. After her divorce, Linda Slayton began a new life as a single mom. She strived to give her children everything she could, torn between work and home responsibilities. Linda didn't have a car, so her sons either walked to school or neighbors drove them. Despite the hardships, Linda never gave up and tried to provide her children with everything they needed. In addition to school activities, the boys also participated in the soccer section. But since it was not always easy to get there without a car, Coach Joe became their savior. He regularly drove the brothers from home to the stadium and back. A week before the tragic events on September 4th, Linda was actively preparing for her mother's move. She was sure that a woman living with them would be able to help Linda cope with the daily household chores and create an atmosphere of comfort and family harmony in the house. On the evening of September 3rd, Jeff returned home from a workout. He felt an empty feeling in his stomach, but there was no food in the house, so he decided to go to his grandmother's house. When he returned around 9:30 p.m., his brother and mother were not in the house. The boy turned on the TV in an attempt to distract himself, but his anxious thoughts did not leave him. The quarrel with his mother, which had occurred the day before, did not give him peace. He tried to put it out of his mind, but when he came home and did not find his relatives, he began to feel a strange longing. Usually at this time, their house was in a state of excitement. Linda's mother was cooking dinner in the kitchen, the smell of delicious food filling the house, and her younger brother Tim was merrily hanging around, sometimes running up to Jeff, hoping for a conversation. But sensing his brother's displeasure, he ran back to his mother. These moments were repeated several times until everyone was gathered around the table for dinner. Around 11:30 p.m., the noise and laughter of family members in the hallway interrupted Jeff's musings. His heart began to beat more calmly. His mother and brother came home, and Jeff finally went back to watching the movie that was coming to an end. At dinner, Linda talked about going to spend the evening with the neighbors and playing cards, but before that, she decided to do some housework. When his younger brother Tim went to bed, Jeff stayed and helped his mom wash the dishes. Before going to bed, he decided to stop by her room to apologize for the fight that happened between them earlier. Jeff remembers that his last words were, "I love you, Mom. I'll see you tomorrow." If only he had known that those words would be the last words he was able to say to his mother. September 4th, 1981 was a tragic day in the lives of 2 brothers. 12-year-old Tim and 15-year-old Jeff. It was then, on that terrible day, that they found their mother, Linda Slayton, dead in her bed. At the time, Linda was only 31 years old. Who could have committed such horrific cruelty against the mother of two defenseless children? Was it someone they knew, or was Linda the victim of a random attack? After Jeff and Tim left for their grandmother's house, Sergeant Edgar Pickett of the Lakeland Police Department arrived on the scene. He was the first detective to begin investigating this terrible tragedy. As soon as he arrived, police officers, reporters, and ambulances streamed to the house. The place was cordoned off. Yellow tape reading, "Crime Scene, No Trespassing," was stretched around the house. Sergeant Pickett was the first to uncover the most important piece of evidence in the case. On a window where the curtain was missing, he discovered a palm print that did not belong to the murdered Linda. This footprint could have been an important DNA sample, but at the time DNA testing was not yet widespread. To find out the exact cause of Linda's death, her body was sent for an autopsy. It revealed bruises on her shoulders, arms, and neck. The fact that she was half naked indicated a possible rape. After a detailed autopsy, it became clear that Linda had first been severely beaten, then abused, and then strangled with a hanger from her own closet. This horrific scenario became the starting point of the investigation, but there were still many questions. To solve the mystery of Linda Slayton's murder, the police decided to go through the genealogical tree of the Slayton family. The first suspect turned out to be Linda's ex-husband, Frank Slayton. Information about him indicated that he was a violent and aggressive man who often abused his wife and children and showed no concern for the family. Quite expectedly, Frank immediately came under the suspicion of the police. He was detained for questioning, but it soon became clear that he was in Alabama on the night of the murder. Nevertheless, the police did not rule him out as a suspect. The second suspect was Linda's eldest son, Jeff. On the day before the murder, he and his mother had a serious argument. According to witnesses, the relationship between Linda and her son had been strained recently. Jeff, as the eldest child in the family, had experienced the full brunt of living with an abusive father and then with his mother, who was raising his brothers alone. Their frequent conflicts were in plain sight, but Jeff always tried to smooth over quarrels and make peace with his mother, just as he did the night before Linda's murder. The police conducted 2 polygraph tests for Jeff, and both times the results were negative, thus eliminating him from the list of suspects. Third on the suspect list was Linda's boyfriend, whose name has not been released. This white man was a close friend of Linda's and often socialized with her children, but polygraph testing revealed nothing suspicious, and police were forced to clear him of suspicion. After Linda's funeral, the family gradually began to get the brothers' lives back to normal. The boys went back to school and tried to suppress in their minds the horrible event that had occurred at 303 North Brunel Parkway. Tim continued to attend soccer practice, and he always felt support from his team and coaches. Coach Joe stayed true to his promise and continued to give Tim rides home after practice. A month after the tragedy, Tim put a picture of the team and coach by his bed. Weeks turned to weeks, months turned to years, but the case of Linda's murder remained unsolved. The Slayton brothers had to accept the hard reality of their new life. Their mother had been murdered, and only their grandparents, Clarence and Margaret Harris, were left with them to support them through this difficult time. It had been a full 17 years since the horrific murder of Linda Slayton. The years have passed, and the boys who lost their mother have grown into grown men full of love and care for their own families. Both brothers started families, and Jeff had 2 children. However, he never forgot that last night. "I didn't hear anything at all. Even the neighbors claim they didn't hear anything suspicious that night. It weighs heavily on me," he often repeated in conversation with his loved ones. Sometimes, sitting in front of the television waiting for dinner, while his wife fussed in the kitchen and his children ran around him, Jeff would catch a glimpse of the past. At such moments, he was taken back to his childhood home, to the last evening with his mother. The unsettling feelings that had gripped him that last evening seemed to foretell a horror that would change his life forever. The voices of his children and wife, each time as a rescue, brought Jeff back to reality. Despite the successful lives the brothers have built, they have never stopped following the investigation and have worked hard to keep the case alive. They regularly return to Lakeland to see if there was any news in their mother's case. In an interview, Tim said, "No matter how many investigators are replaced, we always remind them that we are waiting to find whoever killed our mom. The burden is on us, and I can't let it go." In 2001, detectives finally had a new thread that could lead to the solution of this long-standing mystery. In the same neighborhood where Linda was murdered, police arrested a man named Jimmy Ulmer, who had similar mannerisms to Linda's killer. He was charged with the attempted murder of a little girl he had tried to pull through the window of her room. The police began to scrutinize his connections and alibis and discovered that he was now already sentenced to 80 years in prison for other crimes. For the police, he became the prime suspect. However, a small problem arose. By that time, Jimmy had already passed away, and it was impossible to conduct DNA testing. However, Jimmy's mother agreed to provide a sample of her DNA. Unfortunately, the results did not match the sample found at Linda's murder scene. The investigation again went unanswered. In 1998, the investigator who had been looking into Linda Slayton's murder, Edgar Pickett, resigned and was replaced by a new detective, Brad Grace. Grace discovered an unidentified DNA sample that had been collected at the crime scene back in 1981. He decided to send that sample to the state's largest laboratory, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, to try to identify Linda's killer from the DNA. By 1999, the department already had the means to conduct such tests, and Detective Grace sprang into action. He reviewed the list of suspects and decided to collect DNA samples from each of them. In 2001, he was confident that he could find the perpetrator through his DNA. He first contacted the Slayton brothers and asked them to submit DNA samples for comparison with samples found at the crime scene. The results of the analysis completely ruled the brothers out as suspects. Detective Grace then contacted Linda's ex-husband, Frank Slayton. Frank, after Linda's death, had reevaluated his life and was living a good life. Frank voluntarily gave up his DNA samples. Again, no matches were found. In 2005, Grace submitted DNA samples from the unknown perpetrator to the FBI to be tested against the data in the federal database. These comparisons were made regularly, but were inconclusive. Eventually, 17 years after Linda Slayton's murder, Detective Grace retired and was replaced by Detectives Tammy Hathcock and Russell Hurley. After 3 more years of investigation, Tammy Hathcock learned of a new DNA recognition technology developed at the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. She sent a DNA sample from the crime scene to expert Cecile Moore. Using a genealogical database and other documents, Cecile Moore compiled a family tree that led to the person suspected of killing Linda Slayton. This moment proved to be a turning point in the investigation and a shocking one for the Slayton brothers. The face of the killer was in one of the photographs in Tim's bedroom. That man turned out to be Joseph Clinton Mills, also known as Coach Joe. Police began investigating Mills' background and found that he had been charged with grand larceny and forging a will, but was not convicted of it. His fingerprints and palm prints were kept in police databases. To establish Joseph Mills's guilt, police had to match his DNA to that found at the scene of Linda Slayton's murder. Detectives decided to obtain a sample of Mills's DNA without his knowledge. The veracity of this information is unknown, but this is the version that is included in the case. Police collected trash from a dumpster at Mills's house and found a Band-Aid with traces of blood on it. This patch was sent for examination. At this time, detectives were investigating the suspect's background. Joseph Mills had spent most of his life in the town of Kettleman, which is only 30 minutes from the crime scene. He had a family, children, and grandchildren. 2 weeks later, the lab's response came back. The DNA from Linda Slayton's murder scene matched Joseph Mills' DNA. This result became a key piece of evidence in the case, and Joseph Mills was arrested and charged with the murder of Linda Slayton. In December 2019, Joseph Mills was arrested and taken to police for questioning. He was only 20 years old at the time of Linda Slayton's murder in 1981. Detectives conducted an interview with Mills at the time, but it was done over the phone, and he did not become a suspect in the murder. Now, after years of investigation, It was impossible for Mills to deny his involvement in the crime. According to his testimony, on the night of the murder, he had come to Linda's home with her consent for sexual relations. But detectives doubted his version. They speculated that Mills had been watching Linda for some time because he regularly drove her children to practice. According to investigators' version, after the coach brought the boy home from practice, he waited until the house was empty before sneaking into Linda's room through a window. Hiding in a closet, he waited until she was alone in the room. He then came out of hiding, beat and abused Linda, and strangled her with a wire hanger from her own closet. At trial, Joseph Mills was found guilty of first-degree murder and rape. The investigation and trial finally brought long-awaited justice to this horrific crime that had gone unsolved for years. The sons of the murdered woman were still left in shock and could not understand what motivated Joseph to kill their mother. The court hearing was tense. Linda Slayton's children, Tim and Jeff, sat on a spectator bench defending the memory of their mother. At the center of attention was Joseph Clinton Mills, Coach Joe. This man, who once seemed like a role model, sat in an accusatory cage. His gaze was cold and indifferent, as if nothing had happened. Tim Slayton, the oldest of the brothers, looked at the man he had once revered and now saw in him the face of evil. The fire of indignation burned in Tim's eyes, and he jumped to his feet, turning to Joseph. "Why? I just want to understand why, Joe. Why did you kill our mom? Why did you take her away from us? We were so happy." Mills only mumbled back, "I'm a good man." The Slayton family never received an apology or remorse from him. Probably even the killer himself had a hard time explaining his actions. This came as a shock to Tim, because as a child he had considered Coach Joe a role model. Now he is left with only questions and painful memories. Joseph Mills was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As if a heavy stone had fallen from the Slayton brothers' shoulders, their mother was finally avenged. And while the brothers console themselves with the thought that the killer will spend the rest of his days in prison, they are still furious at the fact that Joseph Mills enjoyed freedom for nearly 40 years while they lost their mother. Linda Slayton's story, her tragic death, and years of investigation have left an incredible mark on her sons. Tim and Jeff Slayton, two brothers who not only witnessed this tragedy, but also became first-hand participants in the investigation, share their experiences and feelings. "He kept asking us how the case was going," says Tim, the older of the brothers. "He didn't ask specific questions. He just wanted to know if there was any news on the case, if there was any new evidence, and I just told him that nothing had changed." Tim still can't believe that his mother's killer was a man he considered a friend and respected. The picture of him standing behind Joseph Mills has always reminded him that life goes on, but without his mom. Jeff, the younger brother, always thinks about how his life would have turned out if Mom had been alive. This tragedy has left an unbearable void in his heart that nothing can fill. Despite all the hardship and suffering, the Slayton brothers try to live a full life for their mother, Linda Slayton. They visit her grave regularly, placing fresh flowers and praying that she knows they will never forget her and will continue to fight for justice. Linda Slayton's story is one of fortitude, of incredible endurance, and of the fact that even after the most horrific losses, the love and memory of loved ones lives on in the hearts of those left behind. Over the years, however, the definition has evolved and varies across countries, depending on cultural context. In most places, it is classified as a severe crime against women, including assault, maiming, or causing death, perpetrated by men amid gender-based animosity. It's often said that women allow themselves to be mistreated, not reporting to police or leaving the men who cause them emotional and physical suffering, and sometimes even continuing to live with someone who might end their life at any moment. This claim is only partially true, as in some countries, the law inherently sides with men, giving them confidence that they will face no repercussions. The story of a young woman named Abril Perez is one of the most vivid examples of how femicide thrives among the affluent sectors of Mexican society. She and her husband, Juan Carlos Garcia Sanchez, were wealthy and respected individuals, holding executive positions in major companies, and from the outside, their marriage seemed flawless. Yet this did not prevent the man from abusing his wife over the years,
and eventually having someone else violently end her life, also risking the lives of their children. To this day, this case remains unresolved, and all but the main perpetrator have been punished. Abril Perez, family and early years. Abril Sagaun. Perez was born on November 18, 1971, in Monterrey, in the northeastern part of Mexico, and was the second of 3 children to parents Maria del Socorro Sagaun and Manuel Perez. Raised alongside her older brother Javier and younger sister Ama, the family lived modestly, but her parents did everything possible to provide their children with a good education and motivate them to aspire to a better life. All the children excelled in school, engaged in music, sports, and other talents. Abril, in particular, showed a talent for mathematics and entrepreneurial skills from an early age. She was an avid reader and the top student in her class. As a teenager, Abril began working to achieve financial independence, was frugal, and always had savings. From her school days, she was very disciplined, able to plan and manage her time effectively. She dreamed of obtaining a high-quality higher education to secure a well-paying job with career advancement opportunities. After finishing high school, Abril was admitted to the most prestigious university in Nuevo León, where she earned a master's degree in finance and business administration. Her classmates described her as smart, incredibly focused and ambitious, but also cheerful, kind-hearted, and always ready to help others. Upon graduating, Perez was hired in the sales department of one of the country's largest and fastest-growing companies. A few years later, she ventured into digital sales, a new booming field, and realized this was her calling. Quickly rising through the ranks, she became the executive director of the company within 2 years. Abril was young, beautiful, successful, ambitious, and steadily advancing towards the life she had always dreamed of. She built a brilliant career, supported her family, and was full of plans for the future. Yet her personal life remained unsettled, which disappointed her loved ones. Nevertheless, she was confident she would find true love and live a long, happy life. Little did Perez know how her marriage to the perfect man would turn out. Meeting Juan Carlos. In the mid-1990s, as Abril's career was on the rise, fate brought her together with a young man named Juan Carlos Garcia Sanchez. He was just 3 years her senior and equally ambitious career-wise, which greatly appealed to her. In return, he was captivated by her beauty, charm, kindness, and disarming smile, combined with a sharp intellect and remarkable determination. Sanchez was a graduate of a prestigious science and technology university, where he excelled in the economics and trade department. He later continued his education in the United States at Harvard University, after which he returned to Mexico and built a successful career in the relatively new field of e-commerce. The young professionals met at a conference dedicated to the latest financial technologies. They crossed paths several more times as their companies collaborated on joint projects, and eventually, Juan Carlos realized he had fallen in love with this intelligent beauty. Through mutual acquaintances, he obtained her phone number and decided to invite Perez out on a date. The feelings were mutual. She also found this educated, erudite man capable of holding a conversation on almost any topic, appealing and interesting. Their relationship developed quickly, and by 1998, the couple decided to formalize their relationship with a lavish wedding. By then, they had both achieved considerable career success and were involved in developing online stores, a very promising direction. Their life resembled a true fairy tale, evoking envy and admiration among their peers. Dark secrets of the perfect family. It wasn't until 2001, after 3 years of marriage, that the couple welcomed their long-awaited first child, a daughter they named Ama Cecilia. 30-year-old Abril was overjoyed, as the arrival of the child marked a new chapter in their lives. Her husband also seemed happy, treating their newborn daughter with tenderness and awe. 2 years later, Abril gave her beloved a son, whom they named after his father, Juan Carlos Jr. Another 2 years passed, and the family welcomed a third child, a boy named Julio Andreas. It's worth noting that the young mother hardly took any maternity leave and managed to brilliantly combine parental responsibilities with her career advancement. She prepared only homemade meals, helped the children with their schoolwork, took them to sports activities, and strived to be not just an ideal mother, but also their best friend. From the outside, the Perez Sanchez family appeared perfect in every way. Wealthy, successful, raising 3 wonderful children, having everything one could wish for, and seeming very happy. But appearances can be deceiving. What happened inside their home remained unknown even to the couple's closest relatives for a long time. In reality, Juan Carlos showed his true nature in the first years of their life together. He was hot-tempered, aggressive, and rather harsh, intolerant of compromise, insisting that everything had to be exactly as he wanted. But Abril was in love, and initially thought that over time they would rub along, and his character would soften. Moreover, their joint projects united them. They worked towards a common goal, and their teamwork yielded impressive results, including financially. However, over time, he became more irritable, and verbal altercations escalated into physical confrontations. After the birth of their first daughter, the husband briefly softened, trying to keep his emotions in check, but it didn't last long. The same happened after the birth of their eldest son, but by the time the third child was born, he no longer even tried to be a good father or husband. Juan Carlos vented his anger, negative emotions, or just bad mood on his wife, sparing no feelings. He insulted and belittled the mother of his children, and her tears seemed to lift his spirits. He then began to regularly physically harm his wife, often doing so in a way that left no visible marks on exposed parts of her body, so she could hide the bruises under clothing or mask them with makeup. All this was done with one simple purpose: to protect his flawless reputation and pride himself on being considered a model family man, loving husband, and father. Abril kept silent for years, trying not to tell even her sister and mother about the ongoing nightmare. She earned well and could have raised the children on her own, providing them with a good education and a stable upbringing. But her husband was a wealthy and very influential man, and he could easily take the children away from her through the courts. Knowing what Juan Carlos was really like, Perez could not bear the thought of her daughter and sons being left alone with a real monster, capable of anything, starting over with old problems. 2010 approached. The situation within the family escalated to its limit, to the extent that those who once considered this household ideal began to suspect something terrible was happening within. Abril was not just subdued, but deeply distressed, visibly thinner, sleeping poorly, and frequently had bruises on her face and body that became increasingly difficult to conceal and impossible for her to explain. Juan Carlos maintained a calm and confident demeanor, pretending that nothing was wrong. In public, he continued to play the role of a loving and caring husband, interacting with his wife politely and affectionately, but at home, he transformed into a monster, making it increasingly dangerous to be near him. Despite pleas from loved ones to divorce, Abril stubbornly insisted that everything was fine and that she would handle the problems with her husband herself. 2014 marked the peak of Sanchez's career when he became the head of a major trading company and one of the most influential people in the field. After this promotion, the family moved to Mexico City and settled in a large house in one of the capital's best neighborhoods. Their children attended an elite private school, and a beleaguered Perez sincerely hoped that the move and complete change in scenery would positively affect their relationship. Contrary to expectations, changed. The man continued to physically harm and insult his wife, increasingly doing so in front of their children. Furthermore, Juan Carlos began to groundlessly accuse his wife of infidelity, and whenever she tried to defend herself, he resorted to using his fists, claiming he would find evidence of her disloyalty. He monitored her phone and emails, forbade her from using social media, and later, finding no evidence, even hired a private detective to follow Abril and photograph any men who came near her. 2 attempts on her life. For another 4 years, the woman tried everything to save her marriage, though her husband's behavior became utterly unbearable. She lived in a never-ending nightmare that outwardly seemed like a happy and successful union, Many even envied Abril, as she had such a prominent, influential, wealthy, and as many thought, caring husband. In 2018, the Sanchez family traveled to Monterrey to celebrate Catholic Christmas with the Perez family. However, Juan Carlos behaved toward his wife as he was accustomed, not shying away from her parents, who were horrified by what they witnessed. At that moment, the woman realized things could not continue this way and informed her husband that she would file for divorce once they returned to Mexico City. Hearing this, in a fit of rage, he grabbed her throat and squeezed so tightly she nearly lost consciousness. Only her mother, Maria del Socorro, entering the room and raising the alarm, prevented a tragedy. When the family returned to their home in the capital, Abril, preparing for divorce, moved from the marital bedroom to a small guest room, but this did not save her from the tyrant. On the morning of January 4th, while she was still asleep, her husband entered the bedroom holding a baseball bat. He struck her hard on the head and was about to swing again. Half awake, Perez barely understood what was happening, but managed to slip off the bed just in time, literally saving her own life. The woman began to scream, and the children ran into the room, having heard the noise. The youngest son shielded his mother with his body, while the eldest son took the bat from his father. Together with their mother, they fled the house and headed to the hospital as Abril needed medical attention. Doctors diagnosed her with a serious concussion and a deep laceration above her eyebrow, which required stitches. Marital conflict. As soon as his wife and sons left the home, Juan Carlos contacted his lawyer to explain the situation and asked for help in resolving it. He also posted on his social media page, claiming that his wife had betrayed him, was unfaithful, and intended to leave him for another man, taking their children and attempting to take all their jointly acquired assets. Moreover, he claimed that his wife had stolen all the money from their home safe and that when he tried to stop her, she injured him with a knife in the shoulder. As proof, he posted photos of a bloodied knife and brown stains on the floor. However, the blood on the floor was actually Abril's from her own room, and the knife photo was taken from the internet. Nonetheless, Sanchez's friends believed his story and began actively sharing and reposting his account on their personal social media pages, calling for widespread attention to this egregious case. While still in the hospital, Perez filed a police report against her husband, accusing him of attempting to end her life. After being discharged, she moved out of their home, taking her sons with her, over whom she was granted temporary sole custody. Their eldest daughter, by then an adult who had finished school and moved to another city for college, also sided with her mother, condemning her father's cruel and unacceptable behavior. Sanchez was ordered to pay alimony to his ex-wife and sons while they stayed with their mother, although the amount was quite small, about $300, which he disagreed with. He himself faced a potential prison sentence, but the influential businessman was confident he would remain free and avoid any punishment. After enduring such a nightmare, Abril decided to return to her native Monterrey, to her parents' home, taking her children with her. It was there that she filed for divorce, and from there she monitored the situation. Meanwhile, she began offering help and online consultations to women in similar situations, and she planned to open a center for psychological and legal assistance for victims of domestic violence. Corrupt justice system. Only in September 2019, 8.5 months after the incident, was Sanchez finally arrested on charges of femicide, inflicting bodily harm and attempting to end his wife's life. He was placed in jail, where he spent over a month, but by November of that year, he managed to appeal the pretrial detention decision and was released. The case was presided over by Judge Federico Mas, who unexpectedly reclassified it, leading to a new trial. During the trial, photographs of Perez from the hospital and entries from her medical records were not presented, and the testimonies of the woman and her sons were deemed insufficient grounds for detaining Juan Carlos. Furthermore, the defendant insisted that his ex-wife was turning the children against him. The defendant was released directly from the courtroom, as Judge Mas considered that his actions did not pose a direct threat to the victim's life. According to the judge, if Sanchez had truly intended to end his wife's life, he would have followed through, especially since she was asleep during the attack and unable to resist. April was shocked and frightened by this turn of events. She realized that her ex-husband had utilized all his connections and paid off the right people to be set free, putting her and her children in danger. She sent an official letter to the judge expressing fear for her life, but it had no impact on the situation. Immediately after being released, Juan Carlos began legal proceedings against his ex-wife for custody of their sons. He forced her and the children to return to Mexico City to attend court sessions. Otherwise, the matter could be resolved in absentia, not in her favor, so she was compelled to return to the capital. Tragedy. Witnessed by children. On November 25th, April arrived in Mexico City with her children. She genuinely feared the man she had lived with for over 20 years and did not want to encounter him unnecessarily. She planned to leave the city the same day after the hearing and had already purchased plane tickets, which Juan Carlos knew about. Ironically, on that day, a mass demonstration against gender-based violence was taking place in the capital. Immediately after the court session, the woman, along with her sons and their lawyer, got into a car heading to the airport, but they never reached their destination. At a traffic light, a motorcyclist pulled up next to their car, unexpectedly drew a handgun, and fired twice at Perez, who was sitting in the front passenger seat, before swiftly fleeing the scene. One of the bullets passed through and grazed the younger son, who was sitting in the back seat, but fortunately, none of the children were seriously hurt. The injured woman was quickly taken to the nearest hospital, where doctors fought desperately for over 6 hours to save her life. Unfortunately, due to severe injuries and significant blood loss, they were unable to save 48-year-old April, who passed away that evening. The victim's parents, brother, and sister flew to the capital immediately and urged authorities to arrest Juan Carlos, convinced that he was behind this brutal act that occurred in front of the children. However, law enforcement had a different view, stating that without identifying the shooter, it was difficult to discuss his motives, and it could not be definitively claimed that it was a hitman sent by Sanchez. The case was not classified as femicide until further investigation. Predictably, Juan Carlos remained free, and the police began searching for the shooter, which could take an extended period. The orphaned children were temporarily placed under the care of their maternal relatives, while their father prepared to fight for them in court again. April's sister wrote an angry post on her social media account openly blaming Sanchez for the incident, but her page was soon blocked and later deleted. Nonetheless, the family decided to fight and draw heightened public attention to the case, highlighting that the attack on Perez happened on the day dedicated to fighting gender-based violence, public outcry, and the flight of the main suspect. The victims' relatives managed to draw attention to the tragedy that struck their family. Moreover, people openly discussed numerous cases where men attempted to end women's lives, but did not follow through and remained free without facing any punishment. Due to the significant public outcry, the General Prosecutor's Office of Mexico initiated a new investigation concerning Sanchez and was also instructed to check the legality of the actions of the judges who had released him. The judges handling Juan Carlos's case were temporarily suspended from work and later removed from their positions. Mexican politician and women's rights defender Claudia Sheinbaum Pardo officially confirmed that the Perez case had been reclassified as femicide and would be reinvestigated, and the judges who had released Juan Carlos could face consequences for the woman's death if his guilt was proven. The businessman regularly posted on social media, calling for the perpetrator of his former wife to be found and punished to the fullest extent of the law. He also noted that despite the disagreements between him and April, he would never dare harm the mother of his children, let alone end her life in front of their sons. However, his daughter Ana Cecilia left an angry comment under one of these posts, accusing her father of cruelty and accompanying her words with photos of her mother taken in the hospital after Juan Carlos had attacked her with a bat. Despite the resonance and widespread media coverage of the case, it was decided to leave Sanchez free during the investigation. He was placed under a restraining order and required to check in weekly at a police station, but after he failed to appear at the appointed time, a warrant for his arrest was issued for violating the order. As one might guess, no one could find the accused. It turned out that the businessman again used his money and connections to quickly leave the country and enter the United States. Mexican authorities contacted Interpol, reporting the fugitive accused of a serious crime, and the next day, Sanchez was declared wanted almost worldwide. Arrest of hired criminals and reconstruction of the crime scene. During this time, efforts were underway to locate the hired criminal who, it turned out, did not work alone. Surveillance footage from street cameras clearly showed two vehicles following the car from the courthouse, in which April, her children, and their lawyer were traveling. The motorcyclist, who later emerged and performed the lethal act, appeared to be in constant communication with the individuals in the aforementioned cars, receiving directions and instructions. It took investigators several months to identify just some of the participants of the incident, and it wasn't until March 5, 2020, that two suspects were arrested in connection to the case. Surprisingly, they did not resist arrest and almost immediately started giving testimonies, hoping to mitigate their sentences. It was confirmed that the orchestrator of the crime was indeed Juan Carlos, who had paid a substantial amount, with 7 people directly involved in carrying out the act. The first to be apprehended were the driver of one of the chase cars and the motorcyclist who fired the fatal shots. It emerged that, while in prison, Juan Carlos had hired a couple of seasoned criminals to protect him, acting as his personal bodyguards. One of these criminals was released a week before Sanchez, and the other was freed several days after him. Once out of prison, the businessman reconnected with them, asking them to find reliable people to carry out the elimination of a person, promising a substantial sum of money to each if successful. When all participants were identified, the orchestrator transferred the promised money and provided precise instructions about the route and vehicle April would be using. The most challenging part of the plan turned out to be luring his former wife to Mexico City. The man resorted to blackmail, threatening to take the children if she did not appear in court. Although she complied with the court appearance, she had no intention of staying in the capital, planning to return to Monterrey the same day, and Juan Carlos knew this from his sources. Despite this information, it wasn't until the end of October 2020 that 3 more participants in the criminal conspiracy were apprehended. Moreover, the arrest of these criminals was initially on suspicion of distributing controlled substances, and it was only at the police station that it was discovered these individuals could be involved in the high-profile crime. All arrested were part of a major drug trafficker, Juan Carlos Maldonado's gang, known as Juan Balto. He had served time with Sanchez and provided him protection, later agreeing to assist in eliminating his former wife for a hefty reward. Maldonado was arrested a couple of weeks later in November 2020. He began giving testimonies, confirming that the businessman had sought reliable individuals to end his ex-wife's life, and he agreed to help him in return for a substantial reward. There was no doubt left that Sanchez was both the client and organizer of the crime, and his previous assault on April with a bat was officially reclassified as an attempt on her life, leading the court to finally issue an arrest warrant for him on charges of femicide. However, the man's whereabouts remained unknown. By spring 2021, the remaining participants in the commissioned perpetration of Perez were found and arrested. Notably, one of them was already serving a sentence for another crime at the time. Also, during extensive searches, the weapon used to make the fatal shots was found. In total, 9 people associated with the same criminal group were detained, 7 of whom were directly involved in chasing and shooting April. Almost 5 years after the woman's death, the main culprit and client of the crime, Juan Carlos Garcia Sanchez, remains at large, with his whereabouts still undetermined. The individual who pulled the trigger, ending the life of a mother of 3, was sentenced to 52 years in prison. 2 other criminals who chased the car and coordinated the shooter's actions were also sentenced to 50 years each. The other arrested participants of the incident are still under investigation, and their fate has yet to be decided.